Good morning. Can I welcome members to this, the 30th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent. No apologies have been received. We go to item 1 on the agenda, the Government's draft budget. This is our third evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2014-15, and today we'll hear from a panel on the budget for women offenders before concluding our evidence gathering on the budget with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. And I welcome to the meeting Tom Halpin, Chief Executive SACRO, and Lillian Kringles, Manager Justice Service at North Lanarkshire. And Anne Pinkman will join us once the Edinburgh traffic eases up out of the West End. It's not the trams. I think that's all gone. Can I thank you for your written submissions and questions, please? Roderick? Elaine, thank you.
Good morning. I'd just like to kick off by asking for a bit more comment on the operation of the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund and what impact that's having on services for women offenders. Perhaps you could just outline from your experience the answer to that one.
Mr Halpin.
Thank you very much, Convener. SHINE, the Women's Mentoring Service, has been funded through the Change Fund for the Reducing Reoffending Programme. It has brought together 8 voluntary sector organisations working with our partners in local authorities, community justice authorities, Scottish Prison Service, and already we have mentors in all areas of Scotland, in all 8 community justice authority areas. We have over 200 women already engaged in the service, and certainly at the individual level, I can tell you the case studies are quite inspiring in the stories that they're feeding back. We have worked with analytical services in terms of how we evidence the impact that this is having, and we are already beginning to collect that data in an agreed format against intermediate outcomes. I have to say that the Change Fund has offered us an opportunity to be involved in the co-design of this service, and that involved, I think, most importantly, the women themselves. We've had focus groups inside Cornton Vale. We've had focus groups with women engaged with criminal justice services in the community, and we've involved workers who are working with these women as well in the design of the service. So I have to say that at this time, that particular initiative has already begun to deliver promising results.
I'm going to take a minute. Do you want to repeat your question so that Ms Pinkman, who's now been released from the Edinburgh traffic,
apologies, can you?
It's all right. We've been there, all of us. Just repeat your question. My
question is in relation to the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund and the impact that was having on the provision of services for women offenders.
Yes, sorry.
Mr Halpin had kicked off with...
I'll leave you to get your breath, but that's where we are. Yes, just if you just indicate that you want... I don't think you've been here before, Ms Kringles.
I haven't, Convener.
No, that's good. Welcome.
Thank you. I would just like to say from the local authorities' perspective, the Change Fund has certainly offered an opportunity, particularly for those women that we work with that are reintegrating back into the communities from serving a custodial sentence. And I have to agree with my colleague from the third sector that that resource has been invaluable in helping us to assist women, in particular, resettle back into their communities. And particularly in North Lanarkshire, which is the area that I can speak about this morning, we've certainly had a real positive intervention with our colleagues in the third sector that has assisted when we're looking to try and reintegrate women back into the society from which they have offended against and from which they go back to. So it's been very, very positive from that aspect, and certainly local authorities have welcomed.
Thank you.
Beyond the mentoring project through the SHINE initiative, we have also got active involvement in co-design of women's justice services in Glasgow, in Edinburgh and Fife and Forth Valley areas, and we are involved in the coordination of women's services, learning, building on the lessons we learned with the whole systems approach with young people who offend, and so the stretch of the work around the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund is wide and varied across Scotland.
Yes, Ms Pinkman, yes.
I would just want to echo the comments that from Lillian and from Tom. The Scottish Working Group on Women Offenders likewise welcome the funds that have been made available through the Reducing Reoffending Fund, Change Fund. One of the issues, and if Tom's already touched on this, I apologise, one of the issues is, of course, in relation to sustainability. It was a 3-year fund, but the new projects, particularly the Shine project, has only really recently got started, and there will be a pressure to gather sufficient, robust evidence over a very short period of time to satisfy the need to evidence the sustainability. So that is the concern in relation to the Change Fund.
Slightly confused as to the establishment of women's centres. Mr. Halpin, you talked about one in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and Fife and Forth Valley. I thought there was one in Dundee, and there are only 3. But
That's quite correct, Mr. Campbell. I was talking about SACRO's involvement in the initiative.
So have we got actually more than 3 of these
yes,
women's centres?
Yeah. And indeed, in some areas, these are physical resources as well because of the geography and the demographics of the area. But other areas, it's about making sure services are joined up and then integrated. So the actual, it might not be a physical building, it might be a virtual way of working, and that is reflected across Scotland.
Yes.
Just to add, given that I cover Fife and Forth Valley myself as Chief Officer for Fife and Forth Valley CJA, the additional funding for the women's centres has again been very welcome. There were 3 funded initially in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee. Additional funding has allowed some additional centres or one-stop shops to be created, and that includes Fife. What Fife did was they made different use of their existing funds to establish a women offenders team, and then additional funding to the tune of almost £200,000 has been allocated from the government to establish what will be 3 one-stop shops across Fife for women offenders.
Thank you. I've got Lane, then John Finney, then Alison. Lane.
Can I ask about the criminal justice social work budget, which is static at 86.45 million? Next year's compared to it's identical to this year's, obviously in real terms that's a slight decrease. Any concerns about that in terms of women offenders and the work that's being done to reduce offending?
Sorry. Yeah. Certainly, from local authorities' perception, we've had quite a difficult challenge in terms of continuing to deliver the criminal justice services within the budget that has been static for a significant period of time. I think in terms of women offenders, they do present some resource challenges for all of us that deliver that service at a local level. As my colleagues have said, we welcome the additional funding that's come through the Change Fund and the ongoing funding of women's projects. I think the overall criminal justice budget continues to be a challenge because it's never anything more than 1 year's funding at any one given time. And in terms of trying to plan services for women and male offenders, that can be problematic. And certainly for ADSW as an organisation, it's an issue that we've raised a number of times, because if you don't get your budget until November, December for your services on the 1st of April, then that presents a challenge in the sustainability of any development and certainly our links with third sector and other partners in terms of commissioning services. So I would say that yes, it is a challenge for us, but obviously we continue to try to deliver the service to make sure it's best value in terms of the spend on criminal justice services. I think as well, given the introduction of the community payback order, there has been a significant increase in the use of community disposals, which is absolutely what we would welcome. But obviously that brings its challenges in continuing to deliver and manage that service. But from the local authorities and ADSW point of view, presenting the budget on a yearly basis is a challenge, but we will continue to try to obviously meet the challenge that's presented to us.
Ms. Pinkman.
I would just like to add to that, as Lillian has said, we have seen increasing numbers of both males and females placed on community payback orders, and that is very welcome. Likewise, we've seen increasing numbers of individuals sent to prison. What we have seen a decrease in is the number of individuals receiving financial penalties via the courts. My concern, particularly in relation to women offenders, is with the welfare reform that comes in and the introduction of universal credits, that we may see the courts impose more community penalties, especially the Justice of the Peace Courts. So we will see more women, rather than face financial penalties, they will by default be placed on a community payback order, and that in turn will place additional demand on the criminal justice social work services.
Yeah, thanks for that.
You didn't. I thought you might follow up. You said there are some specific resource challenges for women in preventing them reoffending. What specifically is different?
I think women generally, women offenders generally present a range of difficulties in terms of some of the experiences that they've had. So they generally are victims of crime as well as perpetrators of crime. So women offenders in particular oftentimes for social work present a whole range of welfare issues that we have to address, along with addressing their offending behaviour and the impact that that has on the communities. So I think in terms of just working with a woman, in terms of the input, the support, the welfare, and I agree absolutely with Anne, the impact of welfare benefits. Oftentimes our women offenders have children and you know, they have many issues in terms of their childcare. So whilst men can present some of those difficulties, I think generally for social work in particular, women present a whole range of issues, not just their offending behaviour.
Thanks for expanding on that, Elaine.
Yeah, in terms of the criminal justice social work budgets, is there an argument in there about preventative spend, that if you had a increased budget, you would be able to actually reduce, or the way that you're doing would actually enable savings to be made elsewhere? I mean, are we getting the balance right, do you think?
We'd all like to do some preventative work to prevent women becoming involved in reoffending and for males as well. I think obviously for criminal justice social work then, from the local authority point of view, we have the statutory requirement to meet the demands of those who are placed on a community disposal or indeed a criminal justice licence. I think we would all see that if we could do some early intervention, some whole systems in terms of young offenders, then we would hope that further down the line then that would have an impact on the ongoing cost of delivering those particular interventions for those involved in the justice system.
There's no doubt that the group of offenders that represent women offenders are very much an opportunity in terms of early intervention, because of the range of underlying issues that are definitely related to offending behaviour. And we see that already through the mentoring support and other opportunities. We operate a service in Edinburgh, another way service, working with sex workers and movement there. And a third of those women have to be referred on for mental health issues. The working with 60 plus women in 1 year, 7 are able to come out of the sex industry altogether, working and supporting them. But that's indicative of the type of support that can work early doors that will take them out of the criminal justice system. We see it already in terms of the mentoring projects, where the women who very much gain from being part of the group of women and having that support are already volunteering in projects across Lanarkshire, working in the community, rebuilding their own self-esteem and moving on, and they're openly describing how this is changing their lives. All of that is much more effective than sending someone into a short sentence.
Yes, Ms. Pinkham.
I would just like to add to that by saying I think there's still huge potential for in terms of preventative work, to invest in arrest referral, diversion schemes before women become involved in the criminal justice system, and also some creative use of support for women to avoid them being remanded into custody. Very often women who are remanded into custody do not go on to get a custodial sentence, but the damage of the remand in itself is sufficient. It causes the same impact as a short custodial sentence would. The relationships in the community, the relationship with housing, etc., are all fractured in the same way through a period of remand. So, yes, I think that there is huge potential for additional investment in preventative measures.
Can I just say...
Can I just ask you, because I think it came up at the last evidence session, that I think, I'm trying to recall that the first time there was discussions involving sheriffs with social work and so on, trying to look at this, and of course you just raised the issue of remand. Do you have discussions with the bench, teams such as yourself, about the impact, whether there's alternatives? Well, it's still, the sheriff still is, of course, entitled to take the view of what should happen to someone, but do you have these discussions?
Certainly, and those discussions very often take place, speaking personally, at the Criminal Justice Boards,
okay.
And we share figures that we would access from the Scottish Prison Service, albeit we've not had those figures available to us for quite some time. But sharing those figures, that data with the Sheriff Principal, who in turn shares it with sentencers in relation to the numbers of individuals who are remanded and do not go on to get a custodial sentence. That, I think, is a real challenge. Remand is extremely costly. The impact on the offender, the impact on housing services, for example, is significant, and it is of concern. I mean, I know that we have done some work, and more work needs to be done to look at why is it that individuals are remanded. I mean, very often it is because of a breach of bail, but and you know, thankfully it's not because people are necessarily homeless. But sometimes if individuals are not making themselves available, for example, for a criminal justice social work report, it may be because as a consequence of the chaotic life that they lead, rather than a deliberate unwillingness to cooperate.
Yes, you wanted to come in, Ms Gringles, or did you there?
I just wanted to say that I absolutely agree with Anne, and sometimes some of the difficulty is that the services that women will require to complete the criminal justice social work, their lifestyle is such that they will not come forward, they will not have the trust in the social worker to do that report, and consequently they are remanded for reasons that we feel could be better served were there to be that opportunity to do the court report while they were appearing in court. But sometimes the sheriff principals or the sheriffs won't agree to that. So we do as well negotiate locally, and you can get some local agreement, but you won't get it collectively from all the sheriffs within your jurisdiction.
I've got supplementaries from John Pentland and Roderick. Or is this on remand? Or
Just Anne Pinkman's just been on with
that's
discussion.
fine. And is yours not on about remand? Yours is something else.
Well, I'm going back to the budget.
Yeah. Well, this is connected to the budget because it's costly to do remand, and we're having to move money about.
Come back to the
So I think that's the point that I'm allowing this to continue. Roderick.
Last week we heard from Councillor McNamara, who said that the engagement with the judiciary is rather patchy across Scotland. I'm not quite sure, Anne Pinkman, whether you think that engagement with the judiciary is adequate.
It's costly.
I think I would agree with Councillor McNamara. It is patchy. I'm fortunate in that I do sit on a member of the Criminal Justice Board for what's known as Central, and for Fife. Those boards, in fact, have just recently merged, but that is not the case across the country. Indeed, in some criminal justice boards, you have representation, for example, from local authorities, from the Chief Social Work Officer perhaps, and again that's not necessarily replicated across the country. And I do think personally that's a missed opportunity. They are stakeholders in the community justice, criminal justice system, and have a very positive contribution to make.
So that if we were talking about the financial implications, alternatives to custody, more could be done, in your view, in kind of engaging with the judiciary to consider
Absolutely,
that?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
You may not have these figures, but we'd be able to put some kind of saving figure on this if one was to reduce the numbers on remand and instead deal with them out in the community.
Most definitely.
Do we have figures for that?
Not to hand, but I'm sure we
could produce them. Well, that's
yes.
what we want. That's what we would like to see, so the money can be used elsewhere within the criminal justice budget. John Pentland. I've got a supplementary from John, and then it's you next, you see, on this. John.
It's to go back to Elaine Murray's question with regards to the criminal justice social work budget remaining static. And I think, Lillian, you said that even though it's challenging, we still seek best value. could you maybe sort of give us some clarity then if is the service being diminished because you're still working on a static budget, or is the level of service not needed as much as it was a way back in 2013?
I don't think in any way is the service not needed. I think the service actually, the demand for the service increases. I think what we, and again, I can only speak for North Lanarkshire Council, but what we try to do is work closer with our third sector partners to maximise the services, the universal services that are already available. And I certainly believe that the way forward is that offenders are reintegrated back into their own communities, and those universal services that are already available for citizens are available for offenders. Sometimes I think the difficulty and the challenge that we have is how do we get our local partners and our universal services to accept that actually offenders are a priority, and women in particular are a priority. They're our priority, they're society's priority in terms of reintegration, but for universal services that may not often be the case. So some of the way that we try to overcome the gaps in the budget and some of the services we would like to develop is how can we have other services take responsibility for offenders as part of community reintegration. So to answer your question, certainly don't think the service has decreased in any level and actually has increased, but I think we need to get better in terms of how we link other universal services and particularly our work with the third sector to ensure that those services are met for offenders.
Our knowledge of the needs of offenders, particularly in through care and associated services, is much more sophisticated than where it was, and therefore we're actually becoming more effective in that. We know what works, and we have to we continually redesign based on the evidence. But the crux of this is that very often it's not necessarily that you need a new service. It's about making sure the existing services are joined up and that people have fair and equal access to it. And really at the forefront of that is housing. If someone doesn't have a place to put their head at night, it's a very chaotic lifestyle, and I very much welcome the focus on through care at this time.
Just to follow on,
I'd like John Finian, because I've let you in, unless it's along the same
it's
track.
probably just in the same track, convener.
Okay.
Lillian, you mentioned that some gaps are appearing.
Yes.
Because of the budget being static. And what kind of gaps is it appearing, and who's picking up and who's filling those gaps?
Certainly there's no gaps appearing in terms of the statutory delivery of the service, but what we would like to do is beyond that. So, for example, we oftentimes have people come out on a community payback order, do their unpaid work, would like to continue to do some voluntary work, would like to continue to do some payback to community. We don't have the capacity to allow them to continue to work with criminal justice services. We will try to network them into other services. That oftentimes, the demand on their service is such that they don't get that placement, and consequently that routine they've got back into their life can be lost. I think, again, going back to our earlier point about preventative work, if the budget was such that we could utilise some of that resource to do some preventative work, then we could continue to deliver more effective services. So I wouldn't say there's gaps in the delivery of the statutory service. I think there's gaps beyond what we would like to do to continue to rehabilitate offenders back into their communities.
I'm going to let John Finian now, and I've got Alison, Margaret and Sandra after that. John?
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel. We're here to scrutinise the justice budget, obviously, and that budget is subsequently divvied up. So if we take the scenario that's been referred to, and we hear very often about the individual with a chaotic lifestyle who's the subject of remand for failure to adhere to bail conditions, who may well not have been under bail supervision. Ultimately, that, when it comes to who's paying for that, that will come from different budgets. So the sophisticated knowledge you referred to, Mr Halpin, seems to be crucial. Who should be responsible for that level of coordination? Because I don't doubt that everyone's acting in very good faith. But, and maybe if I just add another bit to that, with regard to the electronic monitoring and bail supervision, and the comment made by Ms Kringles there about the statutory requirements being met, suggested to me, not just in relation to justice, but in relation to a lot of third sector involvement, if you like, that the squeeze means that there's been a retraction back to the statutory authorities, perhaps leaving gaps. Now, there are budgetary demands, whoever's in charge here and whoever's in charge of the local authorities, and That's the reality. Where is that coordination coming in? Because it's just the same story we keep hearing, and it's not that anyone isn't acting in good faith.
Coordination, very often in the projects, I give it from the perspective of being in the third sector just now, it's not necessarily it comes from the key social worker or the third sector. It's individuals who really take ownership of the issue and work their way through the system. For me, there's a lesson to be learned from the arrangements around MAPA and the duty to cooperate that is placed on organisations and public bodies. And I think that that should be replicated in this agenda, because I've said before that the discussion around this tends to be amongst criminal justice experts, if you want to call it that. But maybe the housing officers are sitting over there, or the health professionals over there. Now, in MAPA, you certainly...
For anybody, not in the committee, but for any of the public that might be interested, if you just explain what MAPA is and does.
Multi-agency public protection arrangements under the Management of Offenders Act, where we manage the risk associated with certain groups of offenders, typically those who have been convicted of sex offences in the community, and we work out the plan to manage that risk. Now, if you're an organisation who has a duty to cooperate, you certainly feel the responsibility, and you certainly would be very conscious if failure was in the system. Now, where we are today in terms of coordinated services for women in coming back into the community, etc., is it might well be that individual case is not seen as a priority or can't access the services. We have had women who did find it difficult to access mental health services because of a chaotic lifestyle. Maybe they're abusing alcohol as well, and they need that support alongside them to get them ready to access and move that on. Now, it would be unacceptable to me that an agency said, well, this person's we've got someone else on our housing list, and this person's just not there yet, therefore they're not. And all the work that's going on around that strategic priority for Scotland actually just falls down because they don't think that that's their priority. Now, we've talked about the budget and saving money. The cost, we've already described costs of people being in a prison. So remand is in a prison, so you know those costs. But if you had small numbers of supported accommodation in Scotland, with intensive bail supervision and intensive support and workers around that, managing that person to comply with their bail conditions and also addressing underlying issues. And it's an alternative to remand. So you're getting knock-on savings everywhere. It might be quite complex how you capture that, but common sense tells you it's there. That seems to be like an awful sensible way ahead. But that will only happen if people feel a duty to cooperate.
And is your suggestion, sorry, I know you want to come in there, your suggestion therefore is that that sort of approach should be on a statutory framework?
We've seen the benefit of having it in that footing within the MAPA arrangements.
Thank you.
My day job is Chief Officer of a Community Justice Authority, and when Community Justice Authorities were established, there were a number of partners, but two in particular, the Scottish Prison Service and local authorities were ascribed as duty to cooperate agencies. And it picks up on what Lillian has said earlier on about our efforts to obtain access to universal services to offenders. And just to pick up on the example that you used about an individual being remanded and the housing situation, again, which Tom's touched on, what we've been able to do through CJAs is to facilitate and coordinate the access to universal services within local authorities. So we now have housing services going in, either directly or via SACRO, for example, going in and holding housing clinics in prisons. That prevents to ensure that offenders or prisoners will complete their housing benefit forms. It allows the housing services themselves to be aware that a tenancy is empty. and they can secure that tenancy so it doesn't become the party place for the duration of the young offender, for example, period of remand. And that's actually been a real saving to local authorities if they can secure a tenancy while, for example, a young offender is in custody. So that's just an example of whose responsibility is it. If we all work together, it's everybody's responsibility, and I hope that's of help.
It is. I wonder what happens at the other end, though, because it's no surprise when someone's going to be released from prison, but people are going straight into B&B, emergency accommodation.
But
and of course the delay, I appreciate it's out with the gift of anyone here and anyone in this building, but the delay with benefits.
Absolutely.
Again, and if we think we've got problems now, wait till April next year. There still is a challenge regarding housing for people being released from prison.
Absolutely.
What are the cost implications of your suggestion of having the supported accommodation? Do we have that, and what are the costs? You're telling us we're trying to see, not just to have people not reoffend and also, you know, sort out the chaotic lifestyles, but save money in the justice budget so you can move it for, say, for early intervention. So what are the cost implications of the route you suggest, Mr Halpin?
There are a number of services across Scotland where supported accommodation is already provided. What we are talking here is about the intensive support and bail supervision that goes alongside that. And therefore, you're talking typically in, if you were to take a service in Glasgow, a service in Edinburgh, a service in Dundee, you would typically you would be talking 2 members of staff plus admin support plus management on course in each of those areas. I'm doing this in my head. So you're probably talking less than £500,000 for Scotland.
£500,000 for Scotland. For how many?
For the
people?
bail supervision.
For how many people? I'm trying to.
This is a specific group of in relation to women offenders. So the sizes of numbers in that, you're probably talking about less than 20 posts, bed spaces in Scotland. Right. But that would have a sizable chunk in the remand population.
Rather than sort of have to do in your head here, it'd be quite useful if you wrote and expanded on that. If we're trying to look at, you know, how you can save money, and we're already touching on things like remand, it's costly, other things, it'd be quite good to have something to put. I know we'll not be able to put the Cabinet Secretary because it's coming today, but it'd be useful for us to be able to look at it in detail before we make our report. Yes.
Just one statistic, if I may. The average daily remand population for women offenders last year was over 100.
Sorry, say that again.
The average daily remand population for 2012-13, I think, was 107. And the majority of those women do not go on to get a custodial sentence.
Right. Yes.
I wonder if I could just give you an example of an initiative that we undertook locally in North Lanarkshire, where we recognised that for a lot of women offenders coming out of prison, the challenge was always the Saturday evening. And it was they were fine during the week when the support was in place. Saturday night, you know, their ex-violent partner or whatever would come round, want them to be involved in misuse and substance. And we actually identified 2, not social workers, paraprofessionals, so justice support assistants who were available on the phone. And if the women needed some support, they would call them, and sometimes, on occasions, have gone out, spent some time, got them over that initial hurdle, and consequently didn't reoffend. And we actually had one woman, and I will be very brief, who had been in and out of prison since the age of 16. She was 48. The longest she'd ever been out of prison was 7 weeks. She's now been out now for 9.5 months. That for us is a significant result, and that's a very small cost. I have to find that from other areas of my budget because she's now off her criminal justice licence, but you know, we're committed to trying to do that. So I think the costs, well, we can cost them out, I think they're could be quite small compared to the outcome for women.
Yes, because there's outcome across a whole lot of budgets if it's successful. Yes, John.
Just
and
one
then
final brief question, if I may,
convener. Colin is coming in after the supplementary.
Okay, thanks.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, John.
Just to Ms Pinkman, I wondered, would you have a comparable figure for women who 100 seems to be a ridiculously high figure for women on remand. Would you have a comparable figure for women on bail supervision?
But we can get that to you.
That would be excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. There's actually something said Ms Kringles earlier on about the possibility of taking some of the money from the budget you would use for statutory work, put it into non-statutory work. What effect would that have on your ability to fulfil the statutory arrangements?
Well, clearly that presents a significant challenge for us. But again, as I said earlier, it's about how do you utilise and how do you maximise using universal services to supplement the criminal justice social work budget. Again, I can only speak for my local authority, but they're supportive in trying to support the justice service and make sure that we can access universal services, in particular integrated addiction services, which for the majority of our offenders we'll need to tap into that service. So that's the importance of keeping the services local. And when you do take some of your statutory budget for a non-core service, then it's about making sure that you still continue to deliver the service in terms of the licence or community order that we have. So we would never compromise the statutory delivery.
Can I? Well, I can wait until...
It's not a supplementary, no, because I've got a queue.
No, okay.
If you're wrinkling your nose, it's not a supplementary.
I'll wait until the end.
I have Alison, followed by Margaret, followed by Sandra, followed by Colin.
Convener, good morning. I want to return to the community justice centres. I've got a couple of further questions on that. The Angelini report recommended a major redesign, really, and looked at the 218 centre and the Willowbank centre and anticipated that. Now, I've heard this morning that we're getting some improvements, but Anne Pinkman spoke about virtual ways of working and not actual centres on the ground. So can we explore just how sufficient these new ways of working really are?
The services that are being created in the area I cover, Fife and Forth Valley, one is a dedicated women offender service, and that was quite simply the reallocation of existing resources to establish a women offender team, and then the opportunity arose from the government for additional funds. So they have added to that team additional members of staff from health and addictions to broaden the range of services that will be available to those women. They have also used the funds to broaden the access points. So unlike Edinburgh and Glasgow, where there will be purpose-built facilities, there will be 3 facilities, existing facilities identified across the Fife area to allow ease of access for a range of holistic services for the women offenders in Fife. And it's quite different in Fife and Forth Valley. It's more about the development, and in Forth Valley, I beg your pardon, it's more about developing group work programmes, group work services and group work support that already exists, that's been developed in the last couple of years. But again, extending that to provide additional services through addictions and mental health.
And do you think that's properly aligned with the vision that Dame Angelini had, or do you think it's local groups kind of going off on their own pet kind of areas?
I think it's certainly much in line with the direction of travel that Eilish Angelini envisaged. I don't think it would be realistic to expect that we would have women's centres purpose-built across the country. So is it perfect? Perhaps not, but it's certainly more than what we had. There is a great willingness, I think, for the services to work together, and it looks extremely promising.
Well, certainly more than we had, but is it ambitious enough, I suppose, is the question for the panel.
I think the challenge will be the sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the additional funds that we've been given just recently from the government, I think it's nationally £3 million, that is for the remainder of this financial year and the following financial year. If local authorities / CJs have to address the issue of sustainability for those women projects, alongside the sustainability of the Change Fund projects, which will terminate about the same time. That will be very, very challenging, given, as has already been mentioned this morning, we've got a standstill criminal justice social work budget. I think the trick in that will be about getting other services to contribute to ensure those services can continue if we're able to evidence that they do work.
Yes, Mr Halpin.
The money that and coordinated effort to deliver the women's centres is really welcome, and it really has placed the women's needs high in the agenda and everyone's thinking, and that's to be supported. Scotland, as you know, is a diverse country, and different solutions, being pragmatic, are needed in different areas to reflect the geographic difference in demographics. So actually, from a practitioner's viewpoint of getting the services out there, I think that we are being ambitious. The one issue that has come up time and time again is the issue of, and where we don't want to get caught out by losing impetus at the end of year two. It takes months to get this up and running. It takes months to get the information coming back in, and we are talking about a 2-year window of funding when we've had to create workforce, we've had to create infrastructure and technology. And really, that's the one point that we definitely need. And we all understand that, you know, in terms of future commissioning and procurement, etc., that's there. But for this part, there's a real plea from the public partners and the third sector partners that we need the other year's funding from public funds.
So, if I might, if this is a national priority for us, and the Cabinet Secretary has agreed that it ought to be, then surely the funding should run for a significant length of time to allow it to settle.
The women themselves need the consistency and knowledge that the service will be there. The uncertainty that would be created around the funding would directly impact on the self-esteem of these women.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add, I agree with my colleagues, and I'd just like to add another point that we've also been successful in securing some of the women's offender funding. I would hope to use that opportunity to actually hold other universal services accountable in terms of delivering those services. Women in particular have real challenges in accessing health services and accessing primary health care, and that generally is because in the past they've been abusive to a GP, to a receptionist, and it's how do you actually reintegrate them and have communities accept them back in to their community from which they've come. And we would hope certainly over the next 2 years with that additional funding to use that opportunity to try and have other partner agencies take responsibility for women. I agree that the funding would be beneficial to continue, but we will try over the next 18 months to develop those services within that parameter.
Could you just, I'm sorry, but you said, you know, use that funding of other partner agencies, get this women to engage with primary healthcare. Could you put that in simple English for me? What you'd actually do with the money? I mean, I'm not being rude. I just want to, simple English. What does that mean in practical terms?
From our point of view, from North Lanarkshire Council's point of view, we already had women's services established. So we are going to, again, similar to the lines that Anne has talked about, we're going to grow the service so that we can actually, we have urban and rural areas within Lanarkshire. So we will get out more of the services out to the women in their local communities. But we will try to work with our health partners to have a health worker, an integrated addiction worker linked to the team that can then screen out the service that the woman needs so that they don't have that trauma for some of them to go back to the doctor's surgery, to get the appointment, to get a script, for example. We will use a health worker to broker that. And then hopefully in the fullness of time, they will be accepted as a priority service, and that service will continue so that when our funding, if it does cease, then at least those relationships will be established, that there will be a fuller understanding of the needs of women offenders in our local communities.
I understand that now, so it really is to get them confidence back and get back into a relationship through a health worker to perhaps then move on to be back into the system with a GP and so on.
Absolutely.
Grow that. I understand.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Alison, do you want to?
Sorry. No, that's fine on the budget. Thank you.
That's it.
Yeah.
I've got Margaret, followed by Sandra, followed by Colin.
Good morning. I probably shared Alison's concern a little bit in the Eilish and Juleni report had looked at a shared location. I understand that this isn't always possible because you've got rural communities, got diverse, dispersed communities. But in terms of just sharing information and having a holistic approach, would the ideal be a shared location for the delivery of the criminal justice type centres?
And certainly, from our point of view, the ideal would be 6 women's centres in our 6 local areas, delivering 6 local services. And if we had an unlimited budget, that's exactly what we would want to do. I think, different setups, different communities, and certainly in my own community, we have women that will not travel 3 miles across 2 towns. So consequently, if you did have a centralised women's service, then you wouldn't get them to come to the centre. So our view is that we set the centralised service up, we have representation from health, from other services, and we take that service to the women so that we can engage in their local community, but not at a central point. But the team is, and I think that's very much what Anne was saying about that, virtual women's centre in each locality. You physically couldn't do that. You couldn't have those services. It would be too costly. But we certainly can have a consistency of service from a centralised point.
While I recognise that across Scotland it might not be possible, what I will say is that where it is possible, it's undoubtedly the right way to do it. We know that through our experience with the Willow project, and the gynaecologist within the Chalmers Sexual Health Clinic talks about the benefit of having the health worker in the mobile unit out with the sacral worker at night and accessing saunas, etc., and outreach, and equally the benefit of having the sacral worker in the clinic with the health workers to provide confidence to the women when they come in, when they be best, more effectively dealt with in the right place. So that it's not just about co-location, it's about integration.
Right. Any?
Mentoring, if I could just tease that out a little bit, the focus seems to have been this morning as an alternative. How much of this is being carried on in prison with the women who are already there just now?
The whole service design, which was co-designed with the prison service and criminal justice social work and the third sector, absolutely is founded upon early connection between the worker and the woman in the prison, at least more, but at least 6 weeks before release, so that there is a relationship before the woman comes through the gate to the community, and the person going through the gate with her is that worker. So it's not just you get a referral, you meet someone, but you meet someone else outside. It's the same person taking them through. So integration through the gate is absolutely critical to service delivery.
I suppose I'm digging a little bit deeper, not just looking at mentoring on release, but mentoring or perhaps some kind of advocacy, because we know the vast majority of women in Cornton Vale have mental health problems. What's been done to address that? That's a huge spend which isn't adequately dealt with just now.
That's also related to the new arrangements for prison monitoring in terms of who is the advocate for a prisoner inside the prison. Now, if it is mental health, they have the right to mental health advocacy in any case. But my question is how effective is that? There's no doubt that SACRO as an organisation would have welcomed a rethink around advocacy for prisoners in that sense. We watch with interest the development of the new prison monitoring arrangements.
You see, how effective is it? How available is it?
Well, I had the experience of one woman who left Cornton Vale who self-disclosed that she had mental health issues. Her view, never mind anybody else's view, her view was that she could not access mental health services while in there, and she could not access mental health services on her release. Now, the benefit that we know from working closely within the Willow project is that very often the services are available, but because of the chaotic lifestyle, they're not being accessed, and that support then brings the person to the service and actually makes it more effective. So sometimes it's easy to say the service is there, but if the woman is so, her lifestyle is so chaotic that she's not going through the door, that can't be the best provision of service.
Yes. I wonder if I could add... sorry.
No.
Can I carry on?
Yes, of course.
I wonder if I could add that sometimes for women, they get very short sentences, and whilst they're in Cornton Vale, the actual opportunity for the referral to be made to the mental health team doesn't happen, and consequently then they will come out, they will not accept the voluntary through care service, and as Tom has spoken about, they will not go to the mental health services. So one of the challenges that we have delivering from the local authority and from the through care aspect is how do we do that intervention whilst they're serving the custodial sentence to make sure that services are available when they actually come out through the gate. Oftentimes health service will say we will take the referral when they're released, we will not take the referral beforehand. And that's certainly locally somewhat that we've been trying to do, to have that referral already in place so that when they come out, you can take them to the service on day one. That sometimes is a challenge, and I would say that that's an area that we would certainly like to have more support from our colleagues in SPS and Health Service.
Can I say that Colin McConnell at last week's evidence session, I know if you've had the opportunity to look at it, did say that what he's looking at to change is that the prison officer moves outside the gates with the parties released, and likewise the people who work outside the prison come into it, and we don't have that sort of solid, literally solid brick wall. So what you're saying, I think, is what I know we've got Colin McConnell coming later, was something, I think, Mr Halpin, you were there that when he gave that evidence. Is there work going on about that just now?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Lanarkshire Justice Through Care Service are part of a pilot that's currently being run with, and we are responsible for women offenders, both at Cortonvale, Greenock and Women Come Out of Edinburgh, working with colleagues in SPS to trial the opportunity to have that engagement prior to release and then linked into services at the point of release. So the short answer is yes, it's ongoing. The evaluation requires still to be concluded.
My point is it's not universal yet.
Yes.
No, it's early days.
Yes. How long has it been running?
The pilot's been running just over a year, 15 months.
So when is it going to?
It's due to, the evaluation is due to start in January, and we certainly will continue ourselves for women offenders in Dundee Local Authority for male offenders, and we would hope that the report would be ready around June time 2014 is my understanding of the schedule.
Can I go a little bit further back? You know, we're talking about mental health service, could be depression, whatever. I know there's been pilots in Cortonvale for or addressing all those people who have been the victims of childhood sexual abuse, for example, and that this has had a tremendous saving in stopping reoffending. Are you aware of that kind of thing going on? And can I ask you, at the other end of the spectrum, there are undoubtedly women in Cortonvale with such serious mental health problems, they really shouldn't be there at all. What's been done to address that? Because we really are on a revolving door with that at a huge cost without addressing these people's needs.
I don't know if you can comment on that, because it's a matter for the judiciary whether or not someone is put in prison. But
just in a general terms, in terms of advocacy for women prisoners, regardless of whether they have mental health problems or addiction problems or both, or any other problem, the SHINE project is relatively new. It is a first in as much as that any woman now will be offered a mentoring service, regardless of where it is that they'll be returning to in Scotland, and that, as I say, is a first. And crucially, the focus will be about establishing, as Tom's already said this morning, establishing the relationship with the woman prior to her release. And we know from evidence that that's absolutely key. And part and parcel of the role of that mentor will be to advocate. Will be advocacy. So it'll be, you know, assisting that woman access housing, addictions, mental health services, just GP access, whatever. And if unfortunately the woman goes back into prison, we would hope that mentor would follow the woman back in, and that's notwithstanding the support that also exists through criminal justice social work services as well. So yes, there are many women in prison who shouldn't be there, but at least now we will have a service whereby there will be the offer made to every woman for that mentor stroke advocacy support.
If I could just press on that, because you've mentioned you are involved with the criminal, with the justice authorities. Is that correct? Yes.
Sorry.
The criminal justice authorities. You're a member of one of these.
Yes.
Yes. I know in the past then at least one have had the flexibility to give funding to an organisation like Circle. They've worked with the offender in prison, and that's continued on the through care with, again, tremendous results. Do you have that flexibility within the Criminal Justice Authority budget to commission these kind of support?
The CJAs are unable to commission services directly. The way in which we were set up does not allow for that to happen, and that indeed was acknowledged by Audit Scotland. However, we can influence and ensure that the way the criminal justice social work budget is allocated takes cognizance of the various needs of the offender population, and as a consequence of that, in a number of CJA areas, allocations have been made to Circle, and indeed Circle is supported through the Shine Women's Mentoring Project as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
I'm trying to move on very quickly to... I know, Sandra, I want to curtail your questions. I've got Sandra then Colin, and I tried to get this evidence with a long sessions today, so in the next 5 minutes,
Thank you, Karina. Good morning.
Sandra.
I think most of the questions I was going to ask have been asked, so perhaps I might try and summarise and ask your thoughts on that. Certainly, community payback orders, the mentoring and the Change Fund seem to be very successful. And from what I can gather from the panel's evidence today is it's going in the right direction for women offenders, only would like to see the money be there for a 2 or 3 year projected period in that respect. The one thing that came out from the questioning and the answers is integration, and I think that's possibly, you can add, what's missing. But when I went and visited the prisons, I noticed sometimes there was duplication from basically services, duplication of services. I just wonder if you maybe touch on that may, in the budgetary aspect of it, save money and be more free-flowing for the women involved as well. And coming along to what John had said about making it, making it a statute that people must integrate, must work together. I would wonder if that would be a correct assumption from my point of view. And I'm also, minded of what you'd said yourself, Ms Pinkman, about the new benefit legislation that's coming in, and also what we're looking to do in the Scottish Government is integrate health and social care. How would that affect, the services that you're giving just now? Is that all right, Convener?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a compendium of questions there, I think.
Sorry.
Yes.
I don't have any answers, but in relation to health and social care integrate. But I do think that there will be a challenge in the next couple of years in relation to the health and social care integration, and indeed the decisions that the government makes in relation to the future arrangements for the delivery of criminal justice social work services. We don't yet know where criminal justice social work services will sit, and I think that there needs to be, you cannot look at one of those issues in isolation from the other. I think there has been huge we've moved so much in the last few years in terms of improving the integration. We're not there yet, but my fear would be, unless we look at both together rather than isolation, that the integration will disintegrate.
Debating integration, yes, it's a long morning. Yes, Mr Halpin.
It's an ugly truth that there was many organisations seeking to work inside the prison with offenders to deliver their agenda. The great opportunity that the focus on women offenders and the Reducing Reoffending programme has given us is the ability to co-produce, and going right back to basics, what is the needs of the offender as opposed to any organisation. And that's the strength of coming through in projects like Shine at the moment. It was designed collaboratively, including the statutory partners, to say what is the need of this individual. And that offers us real lessons going ahead. On top of that, the third sector itself recognised that. And there was a significant piece of work. I chaired the Criminal Justice Voluntary Sector Forum, a collaboration of organisations, where, with support from the Robertson Trust and the Prison Service, we've worked to design a partnership development agreement, so that if a service is being proposed, it's got to be co-designed with the prison service and the partners that are involved, and that has been accepted by the funders and by the third sector. So that was the position we were in. We've recognised that and we're moving forward from it, and the change fund has definitely added to value to that.
Yes.
Also, in terms of adult and social care integration, ADSW have been active in trying to engage with our partners in health services. In terms of that integration agenda, obviously we're unclear where criminal justice social work will be managed from, as Anne's already spoken about. So we're trying to preempt some of the services that we're going to have to continue to look to see in terms of reintegrating women back into their communities. So we're already doing some work at an ADSW NHS level.
Yeah, just a small follow-up, a very small follow-up. I understand completely what you're saying, and I'm minded that obviously health services are universal services, whether you're a prisoner or not. Would you perhaps agree with me, or perhaps want to look at that, the fact that if prisoners and ex-prisoners are accessing health services, then the money should come from the health service budget and not necessarily from the criminal justice budget?
I certainly would agree with that. Well, how that would quite happen would be another challenge.
That's taking us back to not integrating anymore. I think you're making it disintegrate again, back into something we were trying to not have budgets fighting budgets.
I think I'm helping along the way.
I think it's really about universal services, in particular health services, taking responsibility and having women as a priority.
I think so.
Just a general comment to add to that. I think that the transfer of responsibility for the provision of health care from the Scottish Prison Service to local health boards has very much raised the profile of a prisoner stroke offender health with local health boards, and that in itself has been very welcome and will aid that process in access and ensuring access to the universal health services for all our offenders, be it in prison or resident in our community.
Yes, John, thank you. Last question.
Many of your submissions again talk about the difficulties with regards to the funding, whether it be long-term funding. And I think again, just for the record, is to give you the opportunity of to what you believe would be the ideal solution, whether it be, I know that most strategic plans probably run parallel with a 3-year budgeting process. And again, it's just for the record to give you the opportunity to see if that is something which, because today I think we've heard probably the opportunity we've heard that there could be significant improvement in the services that you are trying to deliver, but obviously the uncertainty associated to that is whether the funding would be available to make sure that came to fruition.
Very quickly, as Chief Officer for CGAs, we provide 3-year area plans, 3-year budgeting that fit with that same period would be extremely welcome, and I know certainly our partners, both in the statutory and indeed the third sector, would very much welcome that.
Could I also say, in terms of retention of staff who gain a particular expertise in engaging with women offenders, that opportunity to have their security and our links with third sector would be absolutely benefited from a 3-year funding proposal.
It's consistently the one thing that is said. What I would just add to that is the lack of 3-year funding. We understand that each year it would need to be reviewed and that there would be adjustments. That's business planning, we all understand that. But the reality is this inability to address this, and it's coming from both the third sector and local government, is having a direct impact on the confidence of those who receive the service. These, particularly in women offenders, these are women who have coming to us with very low self-esteem, and when you create uncertainty in that life, you directly, adversely impact on their self-esteem.
I'm not supporting this, but has it not always been the case? There hasn't been. I seem to have heard this for the last 14 years, 3-year funding, and it's never happened. Is that right? Yes. So that's something we can put to Cabinet Secretary in any event, accepting your point that you have to prove your worth to get the 3-year funding right. Thank you very much. And that's thank you very much for your evidence. And I'm going to suspend for Would you like 10 minutes or 7 minutes? 7 minutes. So John wants 10, you want 7. 7, we'll make it 8. 8 minutes. Next panel. Police is early. I think we'll just start. That's very commendable. Right, thank you very much. Now we have an evidence gathering item 2. Further evidence gathering on the Scottish Government's draft budget 24-15, and I now welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and his officials, Kerry Twyman, Finance Programme Management Division, Andy Bruce, Deputy Director, Community Justice Division, Kerry Morgan, Community Justice Division, and Stephen Woodhouse, Police Division, Scottish Government. And can I say to the committee that at this point the questions to the Cabinet Secretary on the Women Offenders budget, if you keep those till the next item when we deal with Commissioner Women Offenders, so if we, we do the general questions, but the questions on the budget in relation to women offenders, if you like, and I think it would be appropriate to keep that to item 3 on your agenda, which is Commissioner Women Offenders budget questions, all in the one session. Okay? And can I also remind members that the Cabinet Secretary is not responsible for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Services budget. These all land in the lap of the Lord Advocate, if I'm correct. I'm getting a nod, that seems to be correct. So before we go on to questions, I understand the Cabinet Secretary wishes to make a brief opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before the committee today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about the real benefits we've brought to our communities since coming to office. Only this morning we have published the Scottish Policing Performance Framework Annual Report for 2012-13, which shows that against the previous year, while overall crimes recorded by the police in Scotland fell by 13% to a 39-year low, detected crimes committed by children and young people have fallen by 22%, and continuing the downward trend of youth offending. Racist incidents are down 16%. Recorded antisocial behaviour, community crimes and offences have fallen by 13%, and complaints against the police are down by 1.7%. We believe that this is proof of our commitment to 1,000 additional police officers. It remains the right one, maintaining that local presence in communities continues to drive down crime, in stark contrast to south of the border, where police numbers have fallen by 8.7% since March 2007 and up to March 2013. Had we taken the same approach to policing as they have in England and Wales, then we now have approximately 2,500 less police, ensuring the safety and security of our people. In delivering such benefits to our communities, we've been at the forefront of public sector reform and now have a single police service and a single fire and rescue service, which was the biggest and most complex public sector reform since the Parliament came into being in 1999. Reconviction rates are now at their lowest level in Scotland, and in each of the past 14 years, the clear-up rate for all recorded crimes is at its highest level for over 35 years. Violent crime is down by almost a half, and offences involving a firearm are down by almost 60%. Crimes of handling an offensive weapon are also down by 60%, and custodial sentences for such crime are up for the 7th consecutive year. The number of homicide victims are down by 48%. Our draft budget for 2014-15 is focused on maintaining services despite Westminster budget cuts, while realising the benefits of police and fire reform, continuing to modernise our justice system and focusing attention on preventative spending to tackle the root causes of crime and help communities and individuals to realise their potential. I note that the committee wished to focus today's discussion on policing, prisons and alternatives to custody, and I'm happy to respond on each of these specific issues. In conclusion, I hope I've given the committee a sense of the achievements to date and our intention to try and work to continue that, and I'm happy to take questions.
And Colin, you've been in first. And Sandra, do you want to be in second? Because you said it's good to get in before everyone else has asked all the questions. You've got to be off your mark. So it's Colin and Sandra, and then Margaret. Right.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In relation to your statement and the likes, obviously, constitutional arguments aside from next year, and the, shall we say, the austerity coming from south of the border, how difficult is it likely to be, looking in the longer term, even beyond next year, to maintain services at the rate in which cuts are being made?
Well, it is very difficult and very challenging, but the budget has been set out by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. We have managed to budget within that, and I'm grateful for all those organisations, whether they appear separately here or are dealt with by myself. So it's challenging. We do believe that it can be done. It has been spelt out by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Equally, I think what I would say is it doesn't need to be this way. There are other ways in which it can be done, other nations operating in a different manner from the austerity budget. But whilst we are constitutionally constrained to deal with it we will.
I was thinking more in terms of, should these problems, obviously we have similar views on the Constitution and the likes, but should the carrying on of this austerity take place, do we have a problem then with the viability, sustainability of some of the reforms we have in place right now? Or would we be forced to go down the road of what happens down south?
I think that would depend upon how swinging the cuts are that have been brought in and continue to be brought in. We've managed to budget. We've managed to do what we believe is necessary, not necessarily what we would like. I have to go to the Police Federation tomorrow and I will feel their pain and the swinging attack upon their pensions that I know they feel very aggrieved about, and understandably so. So we do what we can to mitigate matters. We seek to continue to do the matters that are working, the direction of travel that is supported across a broad swathe of the criminal justice, I think, landscape. But what the situation will be if austerity continues, I cannot say. It won't be as good as it could be. And I think if we had control of our own budget, then we would build upon what actually are remarkably good results in very difficult circumstances.
I'm just looking at the figures that we have in front. How much has your justice budget been cut by in real money, and not in a percentage? But how much is it down, just so we know what we're talking about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just put on record, obviously, that if we hadn't done the police and fire reforms, then the challenges would be greater. This was putting us in a position to be able to deal with the buffeting that we know is coming. But in terms of the precise figure, I don't know whether, Kerry, you're able to assist.
Perhaps if we get it at some point. It's not just
we can
useful to have the
put it in
figure,
and writing.
have the figure before us so we know what we're talking about. I've now got... sorry, have you finished, Colin? Yes. Sandra, followed by Margaret, Elaine and Roderick.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen and ladies as well. Last week, Chief Constable House mentioned the fact that work needed to be done to establish the optimum agreement, balance between police officers and police support staff. He added to be foolish to try to do such work during the 12 to 18 months of the new service. On questioning Mr House regarding the length of time, he said to me that to establish this, they had to speak with HR and also the trade unions, which would take to maybe 2 to 3 years. Now, I just wondered, could such work have been done regarding, between the optimum balance, police officers and police support staff, before or in advance of police reform, and basically the pressures that are on the police support staff, would that be alleviated, or would it have been possible to do it before we actually went forward with the single police force?
No, I don't think anything other than what has been done could have been done. We were dealing with 8 legacy forces, with the SPSA and indeed with the SEDEA. So there were 10 organisations. It is for the chief with his command team, subject to the accountability and answerability to the police authority, to work out just how matters are configured. I think good work was done by those planning and looking towards the establishment that went live, obviously, on the 1st of April and is, I think, shown to be remarkably successful. But I think ultimately how matters are configured have to be left to the chief and his command team, and that couldn't be dealt with before we actually went live.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow-up.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, as I said, further questioning Constable House, and I think it's Steve Bailey, who was your Unison rep, the trade union rep, in regards to the working along with the trade unions.
Steve Diamond.
Sorry, Steve Diamond. I should have remembered a name such as Diamond. It was made very forcefully that they had to talk to HR and trade unions before they could actually come to any form of decision in regards to voluntary redundancies for support staff. Have you had any talks with the trade union groups or with Mr House in regards to that? Is that completely independent and separate?
Well, I meet with both on a regular basis. That's how it has. Obviously, some of these matters require to be dealt with between management and unions. Our sole stricture as a government is that there will be no compulsory redundancy scheme. That's a matter accepted by the Chief Constable and accepted by the Scottish Police Authority. I will be meeting with Unison again and indeed Unite shortly, but the precise terms of the voluntary redundancy scheme require to be sorted out by the SPA, the Chief Constable and the unions, but it does appear to me that work is ongoing. People are applying, some people have already gone, and indeed I understand that the scheme is to be continued, and I welcome that.
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it at the moment. Thanks.
Alison, you have a supplementary?
Yes. Supplementary to that, Cabinet Secretary. You said there you should leave it to the Chief Constable to decide how to deploy his resources. At what point will you release the Chief Constable from the arbitrary figure of 17,234 officers?
Well, we have a manifesto commitment, and that's where it stands. We stand by our manifesto, and it is working. A 39-year low in recorded crime, the lowest homicide since records began, and indeed, even today in the policing framework, a visible police presence in our community is making Scotland a safer place, and we stand by that.
We see now a tipping of that, and an imbalance coming through in the service with backfilling, with the proposals for the closure of police counters. So are you saying when you write your new manifesto, you'll reconsider this matter?
Well, that's not the evidence I recognised from last week. I wasn't here, but I did read the transcript. But it did seem to me that the Chief welcomed the numbers. He said he actually could even see a scenario in which he could have worked with more. Is also no strategy of backfilling, and indeed he pointed out, I think in response to questions here, that he thought it was inappropriate to have officers stuck in police stations awaiting an individual who might or might not come when they could be out in the communities. So fundamentally these are operational matters. We though have a commitment as a government that we fought an election on the visible police numbers in our communities, and we stand by that record. And as I say, the Chief was quite clear. There was no strategy of backfilling. There were instances with sickness, with people being on courses or whatever else. But I stand by the Chief Constable and support the efforts that he's making.
I've got Margaret, Eileen, Roderick and John Finney.
Good morning. I wonder if you could confirm, Cabinet Secretary, that the vast majority of counter services are staffed by police support staff as opposed to police officers.
Well, that's a matter that the police would require to comment on. I couldn't confirm. That's an operational matter. I think it will depend upon the station, it will depend upon the time of day, it will depend upon the shift pattern. So that's a matter that really the police require to comment, and I can't. I can only go by my anecdotal evidence, and I have to say, in the City of Edinburgh and indeed in other police stations, it depends which station I go to, and it depends the time and whether it's during the week or at the weekend.
But if that was the case, or if there are even any of the police staff that are now being replaced by police officers doing the administration work that they do when they aren't busy, surely that isn't really a saving. It's a false economy.
Well, that's not what I think the Chief Constable said last week in evidence here. He was quite clear that he didn't see a strategy or seek a strategy for a false economy. He didn't think it was a good use of a police officer's time to be stuck in a police station, simply being there to man it, to make sure that if somebody does come in, there was somebody there. It was better use of the officer's time to be out and about. So I think I'm obligated not only not to interfere in operational matters, but ever since I've been the Cabinet Secretary of Justice, to take the best advice available. I think the best advice available from the Chief Constable is there's no strategy. They think that there's quite clearly stations where it is not serving either the public, because there's just insufficient use, and it's certainly not serving the public if an officer is stuck in that station when they can be out doing something constructive.
But that argument is predicated on the assumption that it's police officers that are staffing police counters. We understand, by and large, that isn't the case. Perhaps we could have more information on that, because it is an important point, given the average salary of a police support staff is, say, 21,000 and a police officer 36,000. Now, that isn't...
I've no doubt the Chief Constable will be able to give further information on that, and if, Ms Mitchell, you want to argue that we should be reducing police numbers to support, police service staff, that's an argument that the Conservative Party is entitled to make. As I say, I'm confident that the Chief Constable's made it clear he welcomes the police numbers that we have, which has delivered the results that I think are quite outstanding, that he believes that these counter closures and a variation, and some variations are actually to increase the hours, are appropriate, and indeed it is the best use of resources, both police officers and police staff.
I'm not sure where you got your logic, Cabinet Secretary. If it turns out that the majority of these police counters are staffed with support staff, then it doesn't make sense to have police officers covering the duties they do in administrative terms when they're covering these counters. Would you accept that?
No, I accept that the police require to make savings because of the budget cuts that we face as an administration from Westminster. We have done reform, which I predicated earlier has mitigated matters, but I would rather see people go on a voluntary redundancy scheme where the situation and the job that they are serving is not pivotal to core policing matters. That is why the police have a voluntary redundancy scheme. That is why people are applying for it. And it seems to me that if the Chief Constable can work out a scheme where we keep the police numbers and the police officers in the community, where counter closures hours are perhaps restricted, and where those who would have served go on a voluntary redundancy scheme, that seems to me to be a win-win. The civilian staff member is allowed to go, having served well. The police station remains open and productive, albeit the counter hours are restricted. And equally, the police presence in the community is provided, and that is fundamentally what communities want.
I think we're not going to agree in this, Cabinet Secretary, because I think you're refusing to recognise that police staff who police these counter services are not twiddling their thumbs. They are engaged in administrative work that will still have to be done. If we could move on, perhaps, the Police Reform Unit, Unison has estimated there's about 200 police officers currently working in the Police Reform Unit. Given the £36,000 that I've quoted as an average salary, in a year that amounts to £7 million being spent on this. Do you have a comment on this, and do you think this is an effective use of the budget?
Well, I think the Chief Constable was asked that question by you last week, Ms Mitchell. He said he did not recognise those figures.
Equally, Cabinet Secretary, he couldn't give a figure.
Well, the Chief Constable is not aware of the figures that you refer to. There was a police reform team, but it seemed to me proportionate to bring in matters, and these figures are unknown to him, and I can't speculate or comment beyond that.
Well, that's strange, because Unison has the figure of 200, so I'm rather shocked that the Chief Constable isn't aware of that figure. Well, if that is the figure, could I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, to comment on it and the use of that money? Well,
can I just halt this just a minute, because we've asked the Chief Constable to clarify this difference for us, so we will have that, because I think really that's an issue the Chief Constable has to answer for himself, but we have asked him to clarify why there's this conflict of interest.
This is our only opportunity, Convener, to ask the Cabinet Secretary about this very important issue, so I think it's reasonable to ask him to speculate.
He's answered it, actually,
to speculate if the number was as high as 200. Do you think it's a good use of
Chief Constable was unequivocal in his response last week, Ms Mitchell, that he did not recognise that figure. You are seeking clarification. I have no doubt Sir Stephen House will provide that, but I stand with him. That is not a figure that he recognises, nor do I.
So you would have no comment on that? Would you be shocked if that was the figure that turned out to be that?
These are operational matters which I don't have any control over. These are policing matters that he decides, and they're a matter that either you require to ask for Sir Stephen House or you require to ask of Vic Emery.
There's a huge implication on the budget, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, maybe, but when we sat down and brought in police and fire reform, we set out structures that were quite clear across all political parties that the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, whoever he or she may be, would not be in operational control of matters. That was done for, I think, correct reasons. That's how it stands, and you're asking me to answer something that I have no control over. If it is not dealt with by those two gentlemen, then it can be dealt with by the subcommittee, which also has particular powers and was set up by this Parliament to look at these matters. That, as I say, I cannot comment on, other than saying, once again, the Chief Constable was unequivocal, quite clear. He did not recognise those figures. You have asked him for clarification. He will provide it, and I'm absolutely certain that will satisfy matters.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the budgetary implication when the figure is known, and perhaps you'll have a view then, Cabinet Secretary.
Oh dear, it's getting quite chilly in here now. Well, I'm not. I'm warm. And moving on to Elaine, followed by Roderick and John Finney, please.
Cabinet Secretary, you've made quite a lot of reference to the evidence given by the Chief Constable last week, but you will accept that there is a direct conflict with the evidence which has come from Unison. And even Police Scotland have said that 800 police staff posts will be lost by the end of this year. Unison are saying that there is already, backfilling is already happening. Now, whether there's a strategy for it or not, it is actually happening because of the reduction in police staff. Moreover, the reductions which will have taken place by the end of this year will only contribute 25.5 million to the savings required in the following year. And Sir Stephen House said he thought that there would be additional police staff losses in subsequent years. Does that cause you some concern?
Well, it doesn't, because I don't recognise the landscape that you're referring to. We've always said that there would be redundancies when you go from 10 organisations into one, when we have clear areas of duplication, which was one of the drivers for going towards a single service, the improved service throughout, but equally to make sure that we could balance the routes. Then we knew that there were going to be surplus posts. It was for that reason we gave an assurance, and it has been accepted by the SPA and by the Chief that there would be no compulsory redundancies. But we do accept that there are people who have been made redundant voluntarily. We know that there are people who want to go and are currently unable to exercise that right, and that's a matter that we're trying to work with SPA, and they're continuing that. But equally, it was quite clear from the Chief that there has been no strategy. There will be no strategy for backfilling. There have always been instances, that was acknowledged by Chief Constable House, when backfilling has taken place because of illness, pregnancies, people going on courses. Equally, it would also be fair to say that I spoke to the previous HMIC about this, and he indicated as well at that stage there was no evidence of any backfilling other than what has gone on. So it's a matter that we continue to monitor. But I have trust and faith in the clear view expressed last week by Steve House that there is no strategy and no ongoing backfilling on a nature of replacing police uniformly with civilians.
But many of these staff have already gone. This has happened actually prior to the new structures coming in, prior to the new control rooms coming in, for example. So are you suggesting perhaps that these police staff weren't actually doing anything, that they weren't actually making contribution towards?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I think police staff work remarkably hard in whatever role. Some are very specialised, some do jobs that cannot be dealt with by police officers because it's forensic science or it's very, very intense work that a police officer would have to undergo a great deal of training. What I am saying is that the number who have gone have been going because we've had a voluntary redundancy scheme ongoing for some time. The position on control rooms has still to be resolved between the police, the SPA and the unions, but that will doubtless be commented on in due course. So I think we do, and we accept that there are more people going to go on voluntary redundancy. But what I am saying is that last week the Chief was quite clear that there has been, there is, and there will be no strategy of backfilling.
But you still feel that 800 police staff leaving by the end of this year will not have an effect on policing in Scotland?
Well, I think what we've seen is the statistics continue to improve. The statistics are remarkable even today in this policing framework document, especially with regard to youth crime that can be the precursor for further offences as people mature. So I don't see any issues there, and ultimately a lot of the numbers on redundancy will relate to the final position to be taken by the police authority and the Chief Constable on control rooms, because that's where there are significant numbers.
Because one of the points made by Unison last week was that the work on the appropriate balance in terms of employees within the police service hasn't actually been done. In fact, it was argued that because of the disruption now, it isn't possible to do that for another 18 months. Perhaps that work should have been done before the new police structures came in place.
I think that comes back to the point made by Sandra White earlier. I don't think it could, because you weren't necessarily sure who was coming in with what skill base or whatever, and it's for the Chief Constable, subject to the approval of the Scottish Police Authority, to decide how they wish to configure matters. But we accept that people have gone under voluntary redundancy. We're proud that there have been no compulsory redundancies, as opposed to what is happening south of the border. And equally, as I say, there will be no compulsory redundancies. It will be a voluntary redundancy scheme. And indeed, rather sadly, many people currently want to go and we're not able to release them. And that's a matter, I think, I welcome the ongoing work between the Police Authority, the Chief Constable and the unions, so that they can work out who needs to stay, who can go, and we can have some clarity. And I think they're working that through.
Can I move on just to the...
Well, I've got a supplementary.
Sorry, okay.
If it's on civilian staff, is it the balance of something completely...
Just a kind of supplementary in the general terms.
No, I think I'll put you on my list. You've sabotaged yourself, John, I think, with that.
I think you're going to allow me to miss a point then, Convener.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I wait with bated breath for your question, John. Elaine, on you go.
I was just wanting to move on to the Scottish Prison Service. We see a...
Could we keep to policing just for the sake of the report afterwards?
Right.
So
I'll come back to that
who's
later.
on my list now that's going on to policing? Roderick, you were next on my list. Is it policing still?
Two questions on policing.
I'll do all the policing stuff and then we can move on to Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service and then prisoner alternatives to custody. If you don't mind, John, is your question on policing? Well, there you are. You're after Roderick. See,
No,
I've
but,
been so
further,
good to you. Roderick first and then John Pentland. Roderick.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Lord Calloway, in his report, I think referred to the question of extension of court hours so that the number of people being kept in police custody would be kept to a minimum and they'll get to court more often. In the light of kind of recent changes in approach to the use of cells where people are being held in custody, is the government considering kind of a cost-benefit analysis of the extension of court hours at evenings and weekends?
Well, we're aware of the, both, you're quite correct, Lord Calloway has mentioned in terms of the changes and the requirement to try and get people before the available court as soon as possible. I'm also aware of the pressure that the police have had on cells in view of changes that they've had in operational matters and the difficulties that's caused, not simply for the police, but indeed for those who are incarcerated. There would be savings for the police in a Saturday court type scenario. Equally, there would be costs for other justice partners, in particular the court service. And I think what we have to do is to try and work that through. That's why I'm glad that this has been raised at the Justice Board, why it is ongoing work between these partners involved. Some of it can be dealt with, I think, by greater use of IT. Some of it probably has to have some new thinking, and that's why I welcome the fact that the Justice Board has established a working group, tripartite group, led by the police, that will include the Scottish Court Service and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, to look at the specific matters relating to weekend costs. There will be savings for the police, there would be costs for court and Crown, and equally, I've no doubt the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There are benefits for weekend courts. I think Lord Calloway's clearly expressed that, but we need to make sure that in supporting one section of the criminal justice system, we don't undermine or damage the other aspects. That's why I welcome the ongoing work, but I think the point you raised is a good one, and we've taken that on board.
Okay. Just in relation to the question of police numbers, Chief Constable House last week said that if he was being questioned by any panel about how many police officers he would want, 17,234 would be a bottom line figure. He wasn't able to give complete clarity as to whether or not that figure and the extra 1,000 officers included the 320 officers approximately are funded by local government or local councils, some of whom were funded before that pledge came in. Are you able to throw any more light on that particular issue?
I remember the Chief was quite clear that he found it very difficult to work out what had come in before what had come out. We can try and provide some greater clarity, but I mean, a lot of this is dealt with directly by the police as opposed to by ourselves. But I don't know if, Stephen, you want to comment?
We can have a look for that for you. I can't do that now. I don't have that information. But we should be able to get a breakdown of which councils are providing how many officers for them.
And John, was your question on policing?
It was.
Well, I will take you first, because I know I've got you there, John, but he was actually on my list. But you're also on my list. You're next, definitely. I'm trying to keep in with you. John, I think I'm failing. John?
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, it was about economies of scale, and I wonder if any work had been done on the benefits at one stage where the Scotland's police forces had 23 chief officers. Many of them were chauffeur-driven, and it cost £5 million to run their staff association. How many valuable police support staff have been retained as a result of dispensing with many, if not the overwhelming majority of those, and their chauffeurs, hopefully?
I don't think we have any sort of precise details of that, but I do think that we do recall that one of the drivers for police reform was that we would reduce duplication, whether it's senior level or indeed in other matters. Here we go. I think before reform there were 8 chief constables, 9 deputy chief constables, 13 assistant chief constables, costing around £3.5 million every year. The executive team now costs around £2 million. It costs £11 million for the force command. That's not comparable like for like. So there's a saving of £1.5 million there, but it is across the board. That was why I do remember Deputy Chief Constable Richardson, I think, giving evidence and providing matters. Not simply it matters there, the duplication in terms of motorcycles, access to legal advice, you name it. Things were done 8 or 10 times over that are now dealt with on a, if not single basis, certainly on a more shared basis that is providing savings.
Okay, thank you. I have a further question in courts, but that's for a later stage.
We're moving courts next. John Pentland.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, no disrespect, but I'm just beginning to wonder why you're here today with regard well, perhaps in hindsight we could very well maybe rethought the invitation, but because here today, you know, I find that, as I say, I'm beginning to wonder why you are here today, because whenever we have asked, you know, a question on the budget, you have quite clearly said it's operational matters, and I think you're probably quite selective in how you answer these questions. Now, the questions have been asked on a number of things, whether it be from the impacting cuts that are being applied by because of operational matters. Do you agree with those, you know, with regards to backroom staff losing their jobs, counter services being reduced, and indeed, do you think it was probably right that these cuts be applied when Stephen House had said last week that it would take perhaps between 12 and 18 months for a review to take place to see what actual service is required? Because if we're already finding that £60 million worth of cuts has to be applied, when the review is completed in 18 months' time, it could very well be that we don't have the money to provide the service that Stephen House would probably like.
Well, I think there's a variety of questions here. I mean, first of all, do I answer for the budget? Yes. It's not simply for the budget that we provide to policing. It's a budget that I'll go on to answer in questions of courts, and there's questions doubtless perhaps on police and criminal justice social work. That's why I am here. It's separate from the Crown Office and for whom the Lord Advocate will answer, and that's why I was invited here. In terms of the budget, I wish there were no budget cuts, but the world in which we live, this Parliament is constrained by the money given to it by Westminster. It is on that basis that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance lays out a budget. We have faced swinging cuts and we're required to address them. Justice is not exempt from that. If any political party or any individual member of this committee wishes to suggest that budget for justice should be exempt, then you know they're entitled to do so, but they would require to say where the cuts in alternative budgets would be made. That then means that there are some aspects, whether it's courts that I'll come on to deal with, or indeed where policing, where challenges are. There are operational matters that I don't interfere with. Equally, I do think that the Chief Constable has done an outstanding job, and I think he's ably supported in that by the Scottish Police Authority. They are making hard decisions. In the ideal world, nobody would probably ever lose a job on a voluntary redundancy scheme, but that's not the world in which we live. And I much prefer the scenario we have north of the border, where we are not seeing the hemorrhaging of police officers, where we are not seeing a movement towards privatisation, and indeed where we have seen across the criminal justice sector that cuts including 70% of probation services going out to tender for privatisation. So I support the Chief Constable. It's hard decisions that he's made and I stand by him.
So the Cabinet Secretary, then, am I right in assuming that your view is that that the cuts that have been made by the Chief Constable are ones that you support and agree with?
I stand by the actions
regardless
of the Chief
of the
Constable.
consequences.
Well, the Chief Constable is operationally independent, but what I can put on record for you, Mr Pentland, is I have the highest regard for Sir Stephen House. I think he has done an outstanding job and I support him in the work he's doing.
Right, so I'm now going to move on to courts. So I beg your pardon, the Crown Office and PF Service. Who wants to start off with questions? John Finney, Sandra, Roddy, right?
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, we heard an evidence last week from the Crown Office about delays with the specialist domestic courts. And of course we know that there's not specialist courts everywhere. There's going to be some court closures, albeit there's special measures in place. Do you think the budget is robust enough to deal with that, the intensity and of the court cases?
I do. I think that the Scottish Court Service, under the steerage of the Lord President and the Chief Executive Eric McQueen, have done a remarkably good job. There have been, and it's been a matter of public record because of the efforts made by Police Scotland to address domestic abuse, some increases that have caused some initial matters and difficulties that are being worked through. But I do believe that across partner agencies we have the right manner of prioritising domestic abuse. I think that's essential. We do have specialist domestic abuse courts in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. Equally in other areas we try and ensure that we have ways of making sure that we prioritise it, dealing with it going back to the same sentencer. So I think good work is ongoing. I think there's always progress that can be made, but I think a lot of this is not about the money. It's about how the system is applied. It's how you work matters out in the court. There are some matters that cost savings that have to be made in actual buildings, but it's how you process it within, not simply from one part of the equation in terms of the Scottish Court Service, but how it ties in with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, how it ties in with police reporting in, how it ties in with those who are supporting those who are requiring to give evidence. And I think that work is underway, and you know, if there was more money we could do a lot more, but within the constraints that we have, I think good work is underway to make sure we get the systemic problems, and some of it comes from a systemic problem.
I know, again, you wouldn't wish to intrude on the operational independence of the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. To require the level of service that there's an expectation of with domestic violence, there needs to be a lot of personal contact. Are you content there's sufficient resources within that, the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service, to ensure that victims are properly supported?
I mean, that's probably a matter more for the Lord Advocate, but I think they are. I think it would be fair to say, although this is one of the three priorities of Police Scotland, it's a matter fully accepted by the, not just by the current Lord Advocate, but by his predecessor. So I think that we've seen a desire, that we've seen the appointment of individuals to give key leadership roles within the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. So I think that matter is accepted by the Crown and that they're working to deliver it.
And the move that a lot of organisations have to centralise telephone systems, so that if you phone the Procurator Fiscal certainly from the Highlands, you have someone in Dumbarton answering. You don't think that in any way undermines the ethos that there will be special support for domestic abuse?
No, I think the Lord Advocate's done a remarkably good job. I remember being in Campbellton, where I met the Procurator Fiscal who was there, and he wasn't busy in court, and when he wasn't busy in court he was marking papers that were coming through from other jurisdictions and doing so electronically. So I think the Crown have done a good job in making sure that they have that presence there when it's needed, but rather than people having downtime or dead time, they make use of the system. So there will be instances when it goes to Dumbarton. Equally, there are instances when matters perhaps from other more popular areas of greater population will go, for example, to Campbellton. So I think the Crown are being quite innovative there, and I support them in their efforts.
Yeah, well, just to push on this point, and similarly, as I understand that the domestic violence cases for the Highlands are dealt with by the Fiscal in Orkney on the same basis. But a key component of that is, for argument's sake, the fiscal explaining why proceedings haven't been taken and the traumatic. And that will require that personal contact. That doesn't require phoning a call centre to try and find your way through. There's sufficient resources there to ensure that that can take place?
I think there are. I think there's good reason that one person should do it. That gets you consistency of marking and moves you away from a postcode lottery. So I think there's good reason for that. Equally, I think what can be done, there should be personal face-to-face contact. That's preferable. But that can be done by another Procurator Fiscal Depute who will have the legal knowledge to be able to explain matters, some of which might be the complexities that we know in domestic abuse matters of the problems of corroboration and explaining why actions cannot be taken because of the lack of corroboration. That can be explained by a legally trained Procurator Fiscal Depute, since it might be quite astonishing to the victim.
Indeed, I raised questions last week with the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service about the potential of using technology to gather additional evidence. Is that something you would consider trying to perhaps put additional, I think it would be very modest resources towards, and I'm talking about camera support for alleged victims?
Yeah. I think, to be fair, that's part of the Making Justice Work programme, and I think I'd be more than happy to feed that in or encourage you to feed that in directly. The Making Justice Work programme has a variety of aspects underway under it. One, of course, is, as we referred to earlier, Saturday courts. Making better use of technology is something that was committed to by the court service as we were discussing court closures. But I think even without the aspect of court closures, there's good reason to make use of technology. There's cost savings, and there's also the convenience, never mind for many victims in criminal matters, the trauma that can be saved by being able to give evidence from a remote destination. So, yes, we're happy to see what we can do to feed that in, but I can give you an assurance it's part of ongoing work within Making Justice Work programme.
Okay, thank you.
Sandra Fulvey, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to return to an issue I raise quite often, and that's the issue of churn, which actually has an absolutely huge effect on the police and the Crown Office and other agencies as well. Can Cabinet Secretary tell me what steps the Scottish Government is taking, basically, to reduce churn?
Well,
and
churn,
therefore saving,
churn is a significant problem, a huge inconvenience as well as a massive cost. I think there's good work ongoing. We already have seen the Crown bringing in technology that's allowed witness texting service, reminding them of the requirement to go at court. This followed a successful pilot which found that 90% of witnesses thought it was helpful, and indeed 7% said they wouldn't have remembered otherwise. So that's one aspect there. There's other matters of making sure that the difficulties we had in instances, and still tragically occasionally come around, are reduced of trials proceeding where people are in prison and one part of the criminal justice system has not been notified that another part has them in their custody. So I think steps have been taken there, and indeed I also saw the the witness bus, where officers who were waiting to give evidence at Glasgow Sheriff Court, rather than sitting waiting forlornly, were dispatched in a police vehicle to get some witnesses to come to court. There's a matter of balance. They're not there to provide a bus service or a taxi service for individuals, but I think if that got matters going, and it seemed to. So there's continual work underway. Technology is part of it, making sure that agencies discuss and let each other know, because it was absurd that trials were cited and the witness, the key person, wasn't brought in. So that's work ongoing, but the point you made is a good one. Churn has to be reduced. It will never be eliminated, because I do recall the discussions at the Making Justice Work programme about some individuals who, when asked what would get them to court, the answer was nothing other than a warrant. So until such time as we provide a warrant without perhaps them having failed to turn up, there will be some individuals that will be a challenge. But we can reduce an awful lot of needless delay, difficulty for and trauma for witnesses, as Mr Finney's referred to, and the cost to the public purse.
How do you measure whether churn's being reduced, and are you doing it?
Well, I think that would be measured, through the Crown in particular, in terms of matters, whether it's the Crown or the court. I think the Making Justice Work programme brings together all players there. What I can do is get that provided to you in detail, whether it's, I assume it's a mixture of both. because there are some matters dealt with by one and some by the others, although clearly, ultimately, the delays and adjournments would be recorded by the court service as part of their formal minutes.
If we can't have it in time for this budget, I think it would be useful to know in any event, and also the cost implications if you're measuring it. Everybody talks about it, but you know, how do we measure it? How is it monitored? How is it being reduced? And what savings are made at the end of the day to go back into the justice system from it? Yes, Sandra.
Sorry, just a small follow-up to that. I was going to ask that question as well. And when we're given that evidence, will it be able to stipulate if it's basically the Crown Office, the PF's office, or perhaps even, you know, defendant's lawyer who has said, you know, plead this way, or the technicality? Will it be... Well,
some of that will be difficult.
I think you're entitled to offer us certain
I think the best thing I can do is get you a formal briefing from the Making Justice Work programme, because ultimately the Sheriff Clerk will record minutes that would probably say motion of the Crown or motion of the defence. That would simply say, wouldn't necessarily say somebody was sick, their mother had died, they were in, you know, so some of this is about drilling down below that, which is why we've done pilots and other such matters. But I think there's a general recognition that everybody has to do more, that new technology provides some solutions, that interoperability also offers it, because if the Crown and the court service are not on the same page, electronically, so to speak, then difficulties can occur. That can't be solved overnight because it's about changing IT programmes and everything such as that. But we will provide you with that briefing. Some of these things, in terms of estimated costs, will be an estimate because it will come from police officer being at court from 10 till 2 and then being discharged. Presumably that's his day wasted, although the police have, you know, matters have been dealt with to improve matters by making sure that officers can go in later, they can be on call, but we'll get you chapter and verse.
Yeah, thank you.
Roderick, followed by Alison.
Yeah, Cabinet Secretary, I think you've largely answered my question, which is to do with churn, but I think it's worth just asking you that Catherine Dyer said in reducing churn, it's not about individual organisations, it's about the criminal justice system as a whole. And in that respect, the government has a particular role in trying to pull the threads together if we were to make an attempt on reducing churn. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think she's articulated it much more clearly than me, but that's why Making Justice Work Board is convened by officials within my department and in the main led by them. But, you know, it's a partnership matter. All agencies have to work together, and I think Catherine Dyer has hit the nail on the head.
Thank you.
Pulling threads together and hitting nails on heads at the same time. That's Alison.
Might I turn to capital budget allocations?
Yes. That's just a general question.
Yes.
Fine. Yes.
Cabinet Secretary, there are at least 2 instances where there's been a very significant decrease in capital budgets within your portfolio. So a 19.1 million decrease in the capital budget in the prison service, and the complete disappearance, apparently, of any capital budget for the fire and rescue service. Can you explain some details of what I understand might well be revenue to capital switch that's expected to happen?
Well, I'll ask Kerry to comment. What I would just point out that, you know, our capital budget has been cut hugely and significantly, but I pass to Kerry.
Yep. 2 slightly different issues. On the prisons budget, the partial capital cuts reflect the ending of the Grampian prison construction the year before, and then also within year operationally there's flexibility to switch resource into capital depending on how the budget is looking and to make the best use of resources. For the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service budget, that was actually reflected a budget classification issue. Their capital budget remains what it was set at the 22.3 million, but as I say, for budget classification reasons, it's actually shown within resource, and that was made transparent in the level 3 budget briefing that was published and made available to Parliament, and that will just reflect an in-year switch where it will all go back into the capital pot, and there will be absolutely no operational impact.
No operational impact?
No, they will have the exact same amount of capital that was shown always, the 22.3 million.
Okay, and in terms of the prison service cut, what impact on capital projects will that have?
My understanding, and it's probably one for prison colleagues that can come back to, is that there's no impact in terms of it's in line with what they're planning. So again, on an operational level, it's just giving them increased flexibility to adjust their plans and do the best for the prison estate.
I should put on record, convener, for the record, that the budget cut in capital imposed upon the Scottish Government by the UK coalition government was 26% cut.
Are there any other areas of this kind of revenue to capital switch within your portfolio, Cabinet Secretary?
Yes, Kerry.
Yeah. There's no known planned switches, but what tends to happen again operationally in year is as budgets progress, if we're aware of any areas where there would be greater efficiency to be gained from moving small amounts of resource into capital, that tends to happen in year and will be reflected in year budget revisions.
Okay.
Thank you. We've sort of moved on in a way also into prisons and alternatives to custody, but of course that was similar. So, Margaret, yes?
Could I just ask on the court closure, Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware that one of the major concerns is access to justice. You've mentioned a lot about witnesses being able to use new technology, Saturday courts, etc. But that doesn't help the problems that are feared the accused may have, some of them with the chaotic lifestyles you mention, of having now to cope with the logistics of travelling further, which in turn could be a false saving. Would you like to comment on that aspect?
Well, we had this argument before, and I remember pointing out, I think it was probably to your colleague that was sitting here, that, for example, Preston Pans, it's easier and quicker to get to Edinburgh than it is to go to Haddington. So there's swings and roundabouts, but these matters are addressed by the police and by the Crown.
That's all very well to say swings and roundabout, Cabinet Secretary, but for one individual, even one accused person who's being affected in this, and their right to fair access to justice, which is a human right, a fair trial, their access, all of that, then I don't think it can be dismissed in the kind of cavalier way you've just done.
Well, I regret very much that you think it's cavalier. I can give you an assurance that when we sat here discussing court closures, we did have an assurance from police and Crown that these matters would be addressed. I note how highly you take it and how you view it as a clear breach of human rights. I won't comment about what the situation may be in a European perspective about what's happening south of the border, where more courts are being closed than here, but that's a matter you may take up with your colleagues.
This is a devolved Parliament. You are here as the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in the Scottish Parliament, and I think our time would be usefully used if you restricted your comments to what's relevant.
Can I ask? I want to get back to budget implications because that's the focus of it today. So can we go back to budget, which is the target that we're aiming at, without suppressing questions? Margaret, do you want to?
Clearly, there's effect on the budget if these people do not have access to justice. The churn continues, the reoffending continues, the problems continue.
I think we had this debate on court closures. I think matters have been, assurances have been given by Police, Crown and indeed the Scottish Court Service.
I'll move on to, if I may, to Roderick and then Elaine.
Cabinet Secretary, we heard evidence last week about the public social partnership initiative at Low Moss, which I think is being funded by the Change Fund. The Change Fund has a limited life. I don't know what the government's view is on these partnerships and going forward, how they might be taken.
Well, I think there's two matters there. In terms of the PSPs, I am very supportive. I was there at the launch. Obviously, we need to see how they work out, and that's why we'll make sure that we review them. Equally, in terms of the broader issue of the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund, a lot of this came in suggestions from the Angelini Commission. We've provided money there to set matters in motion, but it would be fair to say that a lot of where Eilish Angelini and her colleagues came from was that this was not about providing additional money, but working to get the best system and practice, and it should thereafter be mainstream, because it's working out what works, are we doing it in the right way, and thereafter that should be picked up and dealt with, but we keep the matter under constant review.
Okay. In relation to home defence curfews, which I presume comes from the Scottish Prison Service budget, Has the government got a view on the use of that and the kind of budgetary implications for greater use of such curfews?
I think there's not any budgetary matter there. We would address it. I think that's a matter we would need to talk through with other justice partners, not simply the Scottish Prison Service, but also the views that the judiciary may have. We're open to it. There have been some amendments to the classification and criteria, but in the main I think it's working well. But we're open to reviewing that, and I think that would require, as I say, though, discussions not simply with the prison service, those in criminal justice, social work, but also the judiciary. But I'm happy to have those discussions.
Okay, thank you.
On the reducing reoffending change fund in this previous session and in the session previous week, there were issues about 3-year funding so that, you know, really sustained planning can be done, and importantly people working within the system have some kind of security. Would you care to comment on really strong proposals coming that people need to know without accepting that there might be reviews taking place, there has to be an evaluation and so on, but that it would be very helpful to have 3-year funding?
Well, I understand the concerns that those working in that environment have. It's fair to say that it's across the board. It's not simply in criminal justice. This is the manner in which funding is given to the Scottish Parliament that we can allocate as the government in power, and not seeking to perhaps do matters that would bind our successors. But we are open to discussions on this. But I can understand the difficulties. We try and work with them. And as I say, certainly on the reducing reoffending change fund, it's about trying to make sure that we see what works and make sure that what's mainstream is dealt with in that way.
I understand we're not binding successors, but if you're elected in a government for 4, or in this case 5 years, there was the opportunity to put sustained funding in for 3 years. Why was it not taken?
Well, I think the period of 3 years was taken. Andy, do you want to?
Well, the Change Fund is a 3-year programme. I think the issue with the witnesses might be raising is it took some time for the actual projects to get underway. So the actual time for delivery is bound to 2 years. So it was a 3-year Change Fund. The point about the change was it leveraging money from lots of different partners, so not just community justice budget. So in some ways it was kind of an innovative way of bringing in new funding. But the challenge that we'd say to the partnerships delivering is there are things that they can still deliver the utility of what those PSPs delivering at the 2-year period, and the challenge to them is to make sure they can do that so that they can find ways of convincing the other mainstreaming funders to be able to continue to support the mentoring projects thereafter.
So it's the disparate sources that causes the issue, is it?
No, disparate sources is part of the advantage of the Change Fund. But
of course, it's the issue about the funding being 3-year funding, if you're getting it from various trusts as well as from government, from local government and so on. Is that what you're telling me?
No, I'm suggesting that the point of the Change Fund is to act as something of a catalyst, so a new way of bringing together an amount of money, but you wouldn't intend to do that for a sustained period. You demonstrate the worth through the Change Fund mechanism, and then you expect the mainstream sources of funding to pick it up to sustain it thereafter.
I don't know if I understood that, but maybe it's just... did you all understand that? You did? Can somebody explain that? Somebody? I didn't think I understood that. I'm sorry, I have to. I didn't quite follow that. I don't know. Maybe it's just a long day, but I hear what you're saying, but the issue seems to be that if they had their funding, they would know for 3 years they could employ people, the people would know, they would stay within it, the project would continue, but that's not happening. That's correct, it's not happening.
No, I think it is happening. There have been people employed, the projects will run. The reason it hasn't gone, I think some people complain about the 3-year point, is it took some of the year 1 money wasn't entirely used because it took some time to get them going, to get the employment going on. So they'll have kind of a full 2 years at the Change Fund.
There are a variety of projects. Some are at different junctures and timing. I mean, we're happy, as I say, to keep this matter under review because certainly the PSP, the matter I saw at Low Moss, I think is working outstandingly well. But I think what we're also conscious about is what was made clear by Eilish Angelini. Some about this is about providing money from a variety of resources because we've leveraged in money, bringing agencies together so that in Low Moss Prison we actually have people who deal with housing, we have people who deal with addictions, we have people with all the other issues that are faced, and we work collegiately, so it's not necessarily always about funding one particular individual or one particular post. It's about working matters better, finding out what works, and in some instances this should, at the end of the period, whether it's 2 years or 3 years, become mainstream because we've found out how we should be doing things.
Is this a supplementary to my misunderstanding of everything?
Yes.
Alison, and are you the same, John?
Yes.
Right, Alison.
Thank you very much, Convener. Absolutely agree that it's not easy to do. One of the things Ailish Angelini said was we needed political leadership in this. And you've done that with setting up the Change Fund. But the Change Fund, we've heard, has had lots of difficulties in getting off and running. And it seems to me that it needs a little bit more political leadership for a little bit longer to kind of embed the sort of changes in thinking and practice that we need. And will you seriously consider extending that programme in order to give that political leadership and to ensure that it is mainstream, because all that it needs, if it's a short 2-year programme and they haven't quite demonstrated wholeheartedly that it's absolutely working, you just need one of the partners to draw back and say we're not funding it.
Well, I can give you an assurance that we're going to keep it under constant monitoring. I mean, if it's working in Low Moss and we want to make sure that it's shared elsewhere, the Shine mentoring project that we're seeing with women offenders, if that's working with women offenders, and can we look at something, not necessarily exactly the same, because dealing with, whether it's with young offenders or dealing with male offenders, can be different. What we're trying to do is to use this Reducing Change Fund, find out how we can get better systems of operating, what actually works, how it is we bring people together. If it works, then I think it's all hands to the pumps. We should be mainstreaming some of the stuff that should be done within the core budget, but equally, I'm more than happy to give you the assurance that we'll continue to look at what works. If there's some that aren't working, then it might be that we'll have to look at trying something else. But we're taking the view here that let's try and encourage these projects. Let's hopefully continue them. And the last thing I can give you an assurance we want to see them is just for them to come to an end, especially if they're working.
If I might just push you a little bit further on that. While you're in control of the Change Fund, you're at the table, you're driving it with your own leadership. As soon as you step back from that and you say, well, we'd like it mainstreamed, but it's for the other partners to pay for it, we've lost that momentum. How do you actually ensure that you can drive this forward?
Well, some of this, for example, we're not funding in terms of the PSP at Low Moss. Some people's wages will be paid because they work with the local authority in the housing department, or they work with the local authority in the criminal justice department, or they work with the health board and they're part of the NHS. So some of this will never be funded by us, because what it is about finding a better way of working. So I'm not going to offer to pick up the wages for those paid for by the local authority, but what I can say is if that system works, because remember, within the Reducing Change Fund, there's a whole variety of matters. They're not all the same. How the Shine mentoring project's been supported is different from what is done with the PSP in Low Moss. What we're looking to do is find out what works, make sure that we get good practice and share it. And as I say, sometimes there will be individuals who are being funded, and we'll have to look at how that is, whether it's mainstreamed into somebody else's budget or whether we reconsider that. Some of this will just making sure, and I think the Low Moss pilot is more about that. How do we work smarter? Because all these people are working hard and doing a job at the present moment. Nobody has been magicked up, for want of a phrase, from anywhere else. What we've done is just got them in together and getting them to work collegiately. But I can give you assurance we keep it under constant review.
A specific example of this nature was discussed in the previous, I don't know if you heard, Cabinet Secretary in this previous evidence-taking session, where Mr Harpin from SACRO talked about a situation we'd all understand, an individual chaotic lifestyle, perhaps addiction issues, the subject of remand for breach of bail, perhaps hadn't been under bail supervision, and we heard there's maybe 100 women in any given day on remand in Scotland.
That women in the next session.
Yes, this is about the budget, Convener.
Yes, but it's also about the budget and women offenders in the next session. That's what we said at the beginning, John.
Okay, do you want me to stop?
If you're going to talk generally about remand, that's fine. I mean,
no,
it's
it's actually about the budget. It's about process, Convener.
Oh, just ask it. I'm not going to be pernickety.
Right, okay.
Get away and ask it. I'm feeling kind.
No, not at all, not at all. Mr Halpin commended the approach taken in relation to MAPA, where he said that there was a very good example of how all the agencies could come together. And he said he commended a similar approach with offenders on a statutory basis. Now, I suppose the expectation is that this will happen without the requirement for legislation. Will you look at the requirement to legislate to have the agencies working together if, for argument's sake, these experiences
I mean, I think we're currently obviously looking at the structures of criminal justice social work with the alternatives about whether it's enhanced CGAs, whether it's a national agency or whether it's a local delivery. I tend to think that these things are better dealt with by a willing volunteer than a reluctant conscript, but that's a matter I'm more than happy to discuss with COSLA as we go through the resolving where we're going with the model for CGAs.
Okay, thank you. The background was, of course, the tensions felt with the various budgets that contribute to the overall package.
I think what I can say, obviously, I've met with Tom Halpin as part of this, and I think I've got sympathy with some of the difficulties he faces, and these are ongoing discussions and negotiations we're having with ADSW and with COSLA.
Okay, thank you very much.
There we are. We got there. Roderick, you want a supplementary?
Just briefly, I just wanted to ask you whether the timetable for an announcement on the CGA reviews is still kind of the end of the year, and also just to clarify that in view of the reductions to criminal justice social work budget, whatever decision you take wouldn't have a budgetary implication in the years that we're considering.
It won't have a budgetary implication as far as I can see, and as I say, yes, we're on track for doing that, and that's
okay.
Time scale.
John Penman. John.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, in 2008, the Scottish Prison Commission recommended that the government should pursue a target of reducing the prison population to an average daily figure of 5,000. Last week, I believe that figure was sitting at 8,500. Was this an aspiration that you shared? And if so, how is this reflected in the allocation of budgets?
Well, I think the number of people to go into prison should be decided by the judiciary. It should always be a decision made by a sheriff or a judge, and I think it's a responsibility of governments, along with the Scottish Prison Service, to address matters there. What we've always said as a government is we have to get the right people into prison. We need to make sure that those who are a danger to our communities or have committed an offence that no other sanction would be appropriate, given the public opprobrium, do face jail. Equally, those who do not benefit, do not require, are not a risk, shouldn't routinely be put there, which is why we've made changes on short-term sentences, why we're investing in community payback orders. So I think we're heading in the right direction. I would prefer to see prison numbers coming down. I think that would make matters easier for the court service, and the prison service rather, but so long as it is felt by the judiciary that these individuals require to go to prison, they will go to prison, and what we're looking at here is making sure we have sufficient prisons that are secure for those who have to be there, and we have sufficient matters and indeed alternative sentences, in particular the community payback order in the community, that the judiciary have faith in, that those who transgress at a lower level can be dealt with by tough community payback, not by a short prison sentence.
Right, thank you. And Elaine, I'm sorry.
No problem.
But it was a colleague I let go in front of you. So there you are.
Can I ask you about the criminal justice social work budget, which is static in cash terms between this year and next year, and obviously in real terms will be a slight reduction. Previous witnesses were indicating that that could present, I think they described it as challenges, that they obviously have statutory services that they must provide, but some of the other interventions which they might be able to provide might not be able to be afforded. Couldn't some of these interventions actually do such things as preventing reoffending, and therefore if they were able to continue, you would also have a saving in other parts of the justice budget? I just wondered if you could comment on that.
As with previous answers, we do face swinging cuts from Westminster and we have to budget. But I think on this particular aspect of criminal justice social work, what we have to remember is that the offender services line in the draft budget doesn't represent the only budget line available for criminal justice social work expenditure. There's also £86.5 million contained within the local government chapter of the draft budget document, and in addition we receive a year transfer of £1 million from colleagues in third sector division, which help funds change fund activities. So in terms of money that goes out the door, I think we're managing to keep our head above water, but it is challenging when we face the cuts that are imposed upon us from the coalition government.
Specifically about the level 4 figures for electronic monitoring and intensive support packages. Electronic monitoring sees a reduction of 25%, and the explanation is that it's a demand-led budget and there's going to be a new contract. Isn't there a sense in which actually things like electronic monitoring could be an alternative to custody, and therefore continuing to invest in that could actually, again, enable you to save money in other aspects, like prison sentencing, so which are a lot more expensive.
Yes, that's a fair point. I mean, again, I think the savings actually come around from actually the renewal of the contract, where we've got a significantly better deal, but are continuing to be able to provide the service that was there before. But it's the point you make I've got a lot of sympathy with. It's a point made by John Finney, and it's matters that we're happy to discuss with the judiciary and indeed with others. Public safety has to be given primacy, but beyond that, there are ways in which we can work with the judiciary and find out what they want.
Is that sort of work ongoing? Is there these discussions with the
These discussions are ongoing. Obviously, we've renewed the contract, made significant savings, and I'm grateful to officials who were involved in that to the public purse. But these things, as I say, some of it's about we're out to discussion on these matters in terms of where we can go with technology. Some of it is what we want to use it for. The technology is not only coming in cheaper, but it's also coming in with a bit more ability to be used. So we're looking and are open to what we use it for, and that's out to discussion with partners and agencies at the present moment about just what should we be prepared to look at, where should we take it. There are some things you'll never be able to be fail-safe with technology, as we know in our own private lives, but I think there are more things we can probably do with the technology that we now have available because it's moved on from the technology that existed before.
And of course, there's the ongoing case of the removal of the electronic tag just now, with the suspected in England. So there are issues, I think, about how secure are these tags? I mean,
well, they can be forced off, but that immediately triggers an alarm, and therefore there are consequences. So any damage to it triggers an alarm. Removal for it is simultaneous at the control room. Obviously, we're not in the similar position, as I don't think we envisage a situation in Scotland where somebody of such, although it would be for the Home Secretary, given it would be a terrorist matter to decide whether somebody should be dealt with in that manner. Yeah. That would not be a matter within the current powers of the Scottish Government.
Margaret.
Yes, very briefly, Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware that submissions received by the committee have expressed some concern about the real terms card in the criminal justice social work in terms of being able to effectively run the community payback orders. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, we face swinging budget cuts from the coalition government. We are doing the best we can to minimise it and to mitigate it. And equally, I think the best way here, we've shown willing with the reducing reoffending change fund, is to getting partner agencies to work smarter, because I don't think they can work harder, because they work very hard at the moment. But if we work smarter, we'll be able to get economies and efficiencies. But unless you suggest cuts in another budget, this is a budget I'm faced with.
I'm going to. Can I thank you? I think that I'm not going to say the words. So I'm going to look down when I say I see no other questions, and so I can't see there's any more. Thank you very much for those for coming and giving you these answers just now. I'm going to suspend now and give you another 5 minutes, just a 5-minute stretch your legs before we move into the next session. Okay. Thank you very much. Back we come. Item 3, Commissioner on Women Offenders. That's the next item. And it's the Cabinet Secretary's second annual report on the implementation of the recommendation of the Commissioner of Women Offenders. And we'll also bring in budgetary issues, obviously, into this. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for staying with us and welcome to the meeting Jane Muffet, Head of Rehabilitation and Reintegration Unit of the Scottish Government, and Colin McConnell, Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service. Questions, please. Alison.
Very much. Well, I touched on the capital budget implications for the prison service in the earlier session, and I'd be grateful for an opportunity to explore that a bit further, particularly in relation to the plans that you have for better provision for women offenders, and with particular reference to HMP Inverclyde. So perhaps could have an update.
Yes, I'm happy to take that. Thanks very much for the opportunity to provide you with fuller particulars. On the budget, I think just so that it can be clear with members of the committee, the budget is sufficient to do what we need to do, and the commitment that I gave to committee members the last time I was here talking about women in custody remain absolute. So those improvements are well on track, and the commitments given are underway to being delivered. So we have sufficient resources overall to deliver against the Angelini recommendations, and in particular your reference to Inverclyde. I think what I can assure the committee with at this stage is we are in the process of designing and developing an approach to the management of women in custody that will certainly be an exemplar in the UK, if not European-wide. So whether it's in terms of the resource allocation and how that's being used, or whether it's in terms of our redesigning our culture and our approach, I think I'm very satisfied that we're making good progress, appropriate progress, and in due course I think we'll be able to evidence for the committee a fantastic outcome.
You've said that you think the budget's sufficient and you're well on track, but is it going to be delivered timeously? When will Inverclyde open?
2017.
2017. When in 2017? Roughly. Seasonal. Right.
Yeah, I think we're probably looking at the spring to summer of 2017. And you'll forgive me for not being exact, and that planning's not an exact science, and particularly if we look at the evidence from previous builds, the weather and circumstances can impact on that. But I think if we're looking, as I say, into the summer of 2017, we will have a fantastic facility at Inverclyde.
So it slipped a bit then, really,
I think
because you came in this time last year, you said, I'm confident we can commission, design and build Inverclyde by the end of 2016.
Yes, I think rather than slip, I'd say we've reconfigured or rescheduled. And of course, we learn more and more along the way. And of course, financial allocations undoubtedly impact on that, because we have to look at Inverclyde in the context of the other 14 public sector prisons that we currently run, and we want as decent facilities as we possibly can throughout the estate. So taking everything into balance, and of course you've also heard evidence from our partners in the community too. I think with everything that we have on and everything that we currently operate, I think it's an achievable and desirable aim to have a good and properly designed facility up and running by the summer of 2017, and we can do that.
If I might just pursue that a little bit further, I mean, you've said you've reconfigured and rescheduled because of budget, so there is a budget implication of what has happened then. So the budget is perhaps not quite as sufficient as you were suggesting if you've had to push this back. One of the things that we, when we met you for the first time 18 months ago or whenever, was the lack of prioritisation there was for women prisons. And we saw the capital resources going into the male prison estate. Have you started to take the foot off the pedal a little bit? You've said that you've got other resources that you need to support. Have you started to reallocate some of the funding?
Well, absolutely. I think, and you may want to explore that with me this morning. As I say, we're taking forward not just the conceptualisation and the design and the early planning for Inverclyde. We're also doing that with the new regional facility at Edinburgh, again, as Dame Eilish had recommended. And at the same time, we are taking forward a far-reaching development programme within HMP Cornton Vale. So I'm pleased to be able to respond to say there's absolutely no easing off of the pressure on the accelerator pedal at all. And the reason we've been able to do that is by very, I think, shrewd and good management of the resources that we have. And clearly the implication for that is we've been reallocating, reprioritising our resources towards women in custody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, and then Elaine, then Sandra. Margaret,
I could ask a little bit about the upgrading of Cornton Vale's current facilities, and particularly the remand unit, which was a source of some concern previously. Is that now fit for purpose?
Yes, it is. Is a prison wholly fit for purpose at this stage? No, but we're getting there, and of course that's just part of an ongoing refurbishment programme. I mean, the programme will deliver a refurbishment to all the living accommodation. It has already delivered improvements to the regime facilities in the prison. It has also seen, for the first time, a family centre and help hub, of course, which the Mailish came and opened. We're just about to launch an improvement to the entry facilities. We have video contact facilities in the establishment. So in terms of, and going back to the previous question about, are you taking the pedal off, committing to women? Absolutely not at all. And for those that perhaps not had the opportunity recently, if you have the opportunity to go to Cornton Vale, you'll see a very, very different facility.
Okay, just pressure, and I do welcome the family hub, and I presume that means that there will be quality time that prisoners can spend with children, given the concern various reports have raised about the children of offenders going on then to be offenders themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strengths of Cornton Vale, which, because of the negatives, it never quite made it into the public consciousness, was actually the view of women with children in custody and the need to make that contact. So actually, Cornton Vale already had, I think, a good approach to keeping children in contact with their mothers. We've been able to develop on top of that, not just the facility within the prison, and it is excellent, but through the Family Help Hub, I think we are beginning to really transform the capacity for women to remain in contact with young children.
Yeah, I think it was the quality time, but I won't dwell on that aspect. It was specifically the remand, because I think it was said, if the same facilities had existed in Barlinnie, there would have been a rooftop protest. Has that specifically been addressed? Because that did
yes,
seem
it has.
dire.
There are currently 92 women on remand within our system. And I'm without doubt pleased to say that the facilities all round have improved. 92, of course, I'd rather there weren't 92 women on remand, but there are. And I think, again, when you get the chance to go back to Cornton Vale, you'll see that the culture change that's occurring there is to look at women as individuals rather than just a homogenous group. Look at women as individuals and try and address their needs in that way. So I think our regime is more flexible and more sensitised towards providing the needs for those who are on remand, as well as those needs who are serving a sentence.
But specifically on the estate, Mr McConnell.
Yes, I thought I had, with all due respect, I thought I had
it's
answered
treating
that.
them as individuals, maybe services they can access or this, but I think it was the physical thing even of not sufficient toilets.
Yes, and again...
all that has been addressed.
That's been addressed, yeah.
That's great. Could I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, about the mental health issues within prison and how that's being addressed, given it's such a huge problem with offenders who are already in prison?
Well, that's why we've set up a variety of projects that are examining different approaches to assisting women offenders with mental health problems. There are concept tests which help us see how specific methods can be helpful in this context. Tests are run on a small scale in criminal justice settings. It helps develop an evidence base about what works and how to implement that change. And all these projects, or both projects, will commit to ensure that early learning is shared across Scotland in the arenas of criminal justice, mental health and substance abuse, since they all are interact. And I think it also comes back to the point that Colin was making. It's about looking and dealing with the individual, working out what their particular problems are, but giving them support. And that's what we're doing with partner agencies, whether in criminal justice, social work, or indeed the National Health, and indeed third sector agencies that deal with addiction, use or abuse.
Just on that, in the previous session, some concern was expressed about the through care and the ability to provide a comprehensive service in terms of mental health when women are released from prison. Do you have a comment on that specifically?
Well, that's what we're looking to work with. A lot of this, since the NHS, Scottish Prison Health, has gone into the NHS. This is meant to try and allow us to have a break for what might have been a logjam in terms of people not getting access to services when they left. So this is work in progress. It's about ensuring that we get boards to take responsibility, which in the main I think they are. So I think this is matters that are working through as we see the transition from the Scottish Prison Service Health Service into the National Health Service.
And just finally, Cabinet Secretary, on the issue of staff having to deal with the people who are, and it's a very small percentage, but are in prison with mental health problems which are so severe, there's a question mark if the prison staff are able to adequately deal with them. There is no equivalent of Carstairs for women prisoners, so has the Scottish Government looked at that specifically?
Well, if somebody was unfit to plead, then they would not be sent to a Scottish prison, and arrangements would require to be made, whether within Scotland or elsewhere, for them to be dealt with. If they are capable of pleading and are convicted or remanded, but do have additional mental health issues that wouldn't necessarily, as I say, be a capacity factor, then I think the point you make, prison has to deal with them. That's what the courts have imposed upon them, usually with good reason. I think the staff do an outstanding job, and they try and work with the National Health Service. That comes back to why did we mainstream the Scottish Prison Service Health Service into the NHS. It's to deal with these matters where we need the totality of the NHS to be able to provide for it. It's very difficult. These people have challenging issues, but to prison they have been sent. Prison requires to accept them. They cannot turn them away. And I think the staff and those from the NHS do what they can to try and work with them.
Yes, I mean, just to build on the Cabinet Secretary's answer, and again, I think it's part of how are we addressing the cultural approach in Contrin Vale. And there's two specific examples I'd want to give you of how we're improving the situation. You've asked about the staff approach to managing women in custody, particularly those presenting mental health difficulties. Now, I'm pleased to be able to respond that we've looked in detail at the professionalisation of our staff, and that's something we're going to talk more about in due course. But particularly the gender-specific training that we are about to provide for women, for our staff working with women. And I just want to quote here, just so I don't miss any of the detail. We're improving our training on mental health, on trauma, on mentalisation and on borderline personality disorders. Now, that's not to turn our staff into mental health nurses. That's a level of professionalisation and qualification that we could never reach. Of course, our NHS colleagues provide that. But what we can do is build in a foundation of receptiveness to the condition and to some of the presenting behaviours, and help our staff better to work with women as a sort of agent linking the other facilities and professionals that can be brought to bear. And then looking ahead, building on that work, we are totally revising the training approach to all our future prison officers who are going to work with women in custody. And by the summer of 2014, a completely revised training approach will have been implemented. So there's a lot underway and specifically designed to address the concerns that you've raised.
Well, let's hope these do pan out, because, as we all know, it's a huge issue within prison. Thank you for that.
Just as you probably don't have this information, but you said, you know, if someone doesn't have the capacity to plead, then obviously they would be sent to some other. How many women does that? Do we have any notion of any women that might affect? 1, 2, or not. You might not.
We don't
know.
have that information.
It would be useful to know what happens if there isn't a facility in Scotland where these women are sent, where
Well,
they're
I can
cared
think of
for.
one prisoner who has gone to Rampton, but I mean, there are arrangements with other jurisdictions.
Right. Just to clarify that point, I've got before I take you, Alison Lane, you were coming in remand. Is it the remand question? Alison, what's your question going to be on?
Mental health.
Well, we'll take the mental health if you like first.
Thank
Yes.
you. Just to follow up on that, and I can say that I have been back to Conton Vale to see the improvements, and I acknowledge the improvements that have been made, and I welcome them. But there's still some way to go, I think, particularly around about the management of mental health, and I appreciate what you're saying there. I visited I don't know what the most up-to-date euphemism is it management suite or the isolation unit, and the one that replaced the back cells?
Yes, it's the intensive management support suite.
Intensive management support. There's still a very, very heavy dependence on isolation, on putting people into isolation for what I fear is a very long period of time, sustained time, and I feel it raises issues of human rights. While I recognise why a woman is put into that kind of isolation, because there's profound issues of self-harming and things going on, I want to know what further thinking is being carried out by the service, of what the Cabinet Secretary thinks about the longer-term future for managing women like this.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to pick that up. I mean, I share your views entirely. That I mean, I'd much rather that we didn't have women in custody who displayed those behaviours or with whom we had such concerns, but we do. And there's the issue of protecting them and protecting others, and trying to provide for them a reasonable environment in which other interventions can take place. And I was in Conton Vale about 3 weeks ago and visited the suite that you were talking about, and there's undoubtedly a small number of women, particularly young women, who are extraordinarily distressed. And it does, you could say on one hand, it plucks the heartstrings, as well as those sort of professional concerns that women find themselves in those conditions, but they do. But the Scottish Prison Service is absolutely committed to looking at women as everybody in custody, as individuals, and trying to work in as joined up a way as we possibly can with our professional colleagues elsewhere. I mean, this isn't something about the prison service being able to do everything. I think we act as facilitator and gateway and conduit and advocate to make sure that everybody in our care, be they suffering from mental health issues or not, to get the appropriate level of care brought to them.
But if I might, convener, at what point does the isolation itself compound the problem?
Well, we take, obviously, I'm very much aware of that, as is our governors and our staff, and we take professional advice, working with our colleagues in the NHS in terms of clinical psychology and psychiatry, and those who work with us from the third and not-for-profit sector in terms of providing general support and counselling. So there's a whole range of professionals and other interested parties that come to bear in those circumstances. And we really do, through case management and through case reviews, try to plot the best way forward, the best way possible in the circumstances forward for those individuals.
Are you able, perhaps in writing, to give committee the figures of the number of young women and the length of time they spend at any one time in isolation?
I'd be very happy to do that.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about remand. Just before that, though, I visited Conton Vale during the summer. Clearly, there has been a fair amount of investment in the estate there. What's the future of that part of the estate post 2017 when the new facility comes up?
Our current position would be to close Conton Vale as we commission the facilities at Inverclyde and Edinburgh. So that's my current approach. There's, as the saying goes, there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge between now and then. So that's our current plan. But we'll keep reviewing that plan as the months and years roll by.
It does seem to have had a lot of money invested in it to be
Well,
not to find some other use for it.
Well, I take your point, and we are spending a significant amount of resource in upgrading Cornvale, but I would say rightly so, because I think we all accepted, by whatever means we got there, sustaining Cornvale in the way that it was simply wasn't acceptable. And if we're looking to 2017 for the new facilities to come on, then it's only right that those that pass into our care have reasonable living circumstances between now and then.
Can I come to a point on remand? In the previous session, we were advised that the average, I mean, you said there were 92 women on remand at the moment, but the average daily remand population of women is, I think, 107, but most of them do not go on to be given a custodial sentence. Many of those women are on remand because they haven't been able to engage with, whether it's bail supervision or whoever they have to engage with because of their chaotic lifestyles and so on. Is there not a better possibility for those women? Should those women not be dealt with otherwise or supported otherwise, rather than put into expensive accommodation in prison, rather than being assisted in the community? I mean, Tom Hapland suggested to us that for an investment of £0.5 million, you could provide supported accommodation, which would enable these women to engage better and actually might prevent further reoffending in the future too.
Well, some of the planned services that have come out in Reducing Reoffending Change Fund have specific plans to enhance provision of bail supervision. Not all do, but each proposal has been made by local bodies to reflect their local priorities, and funding is provided to local authorities via the CGA grant allocation for the provision of both bail supervision and bail information services. Local authorities are free to allocate that as they do, so we'll be looking to learn from what is working. Obviously, some areas that are more rural or isolated, how we do things has to be different from areas where you've got the city conurbation and critical mass. But we're looking to work out, to some extent, what it is that works with each of these individuals. And it comes back to the point that Colin McConnell said. It's about, I think, dealing with the individual. What is it that's driving the issues? And the whole purpose of these community justice centres is to try and bring together housing, social work, mental health, addiction, so that you can get the treatment, support and assistance that the individual requires, because each one will have different needs or wants.
Are there specific initiatives aimed at reducing the numbers of women who are on remand, and in particular those who actually aren't going to serve a prison sentence anyway? Is there actual action being taken to try and reduce those numbers?
Well, that's part of what we've been doing with the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund, with the Shine mentoring project, because we're conscious that, you know, one of the aspects at work is mentoring and peer support, and that's why Tom Halpin and SACRO are doing a remarkably good job there. So, as I say, we are looking at trying to ensure that we reduce the number of remands, that we stabilise people, so as well as trying to make sure we reduce reoffending and people coming out of the prison estate, and there's aspects we've commented on with regard to prison. We would prefer that they didn't go in the first place, and indeed that we can provide some greater assurance perhaps for the judiciary that they can be dealt with. There are still instances, apocryphal or whatever, where people are remanded for their own safety or well-being to the care of the Scottish Prison Service. And I think what we're looking to do is to work with the judiciary to make sure that they realise that perhaps that is not the best thing or the kindest thing to do, because I've no doubt it's done out of goodness as opposed to any malice, but actually that there are other facilities that will be available for them that would not result in a remand and all the issues that then follow in medication, in addiction, in housing, and the difficulties that the prison service have to cope with. So it's multi-agency, it's working with the judiciary, as well as making sure we've got the support facilities in the community.
Has the communication to the judiciary about alternatives to remand, well, indeed, at the end of the day, perhaps even alternatives to custody, how good is the communication about that? Because I remember years ago in a Justice Committee, it wasn't, maybe sheriffs might be sitting not aware what was available to them at the time when they were making their decision. How up to date is that communication now for sheriffs, and how do we make sure that improves so there's not a disconnect?
Well, I think there's two aspects. First of all, the Judicial Studies Institute, I think, is doing a remarkably good job by Sheriff Welsh and his colleagues in the system there in the training, not just for those who are going on to sit on the bench, but ongoing professional development. So I think there's outstanding work there that is challenging. The things that perhaps you don't necessarily go having experience as a lawyer in terms of psychology and all the aspects that have to be learned about what works and why people act in the manner they do. So there's that aspect there. Equally, a lot of these matters have to be dealt with more locally, where we look to CGAs, we look to the Sheriff Principal about how they engage, because a clear lesson from both McLeish and Angelini was where there was a good relationship between the judiciary and the criminal justice social work. Yes. Matters worked remarkably well. Yes. Some of that may ultimately be about personalities, but what we're looking to do is to try and work out what works and why it works in some areas. But certainly the templates, and I do remember Leslie Riddick going on about the benefits of Falkirk, and it was quite clear that there was a good relationship between Sheriff Caldwell and indeed the Criminal Justice Social Work Department. One felt they could phone the other, they could ask what's available, yes. Felt they could get support. So it's to try and provide that. Some of that we cannot legislate for and we cannot direct as a government, but we can try and encourage good practice, and I think that's what we're trying to roll out, where there is that cooperation. We've got somebody, we need to do something with them. How can you help us provide it? And it's a two-way, it has to be a two-way process.
And it's improving, this is what I'm getting and trying to find out, because, you know, we've been here before a long time ago, but it was the sheriff sitting there knowing what practically was available at that. Is there a house for somebody to go to? You know, what support will they have when they go out? Very practical matters like that. That's really what I was trying to get at.
I think that's why we've brought out these matters, because I certainly had the same anecdotal evidence that you had of sheriffs who wanted to send somebody to the 218 centre or whatever, which is why, as I say, we know that that has worked. We took out what works best there, which is getting people together, which is why that's being replicated in Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, in other areas such as in Angus and Fife, because of the smaller towns but requiring to cover a wider area. It's been dealt with in different ways, but we're trying to ensure that we provide that template, which we know is what a lot of sheriffs wanted access to.
I think it's also because the evidence about remand wasn't only the cost, it was the fact that it was detrimental to the person as well. So it's even counterproductive, made matters worse, and there'd be cost implications for that. So I think the committee would be looking to see improvements in the drop in the use of remand, if possible, and instead maintaining people within the community and the savings that have been incurred, and also the benefit to the person themselves. Is it a matter of budgets being, I mean, I'm trying to understand, is it maybe local authorities don't want to take on the cost or of providing the accommodation or the service and leaving it to the prison service to carry it? Is it such a silo budgets that might be an issue here?
I think there'll be a variety of factors. For some, it might be a lack of awareness or understanding of what might be available. For others, it might be particular access. And as I say, I have mentioned some sheriffs who said to me they would have welcomed the ability to have sent somebody to 218, but they didn't have it in their locality. So we're trying to address that. So some of it is about knowledge raising. Some of it's about making sure that judiciary and social work interact. Some of it's about making sure those facilities are there. Sometimes it's not about new centres, because a lot of these other matters that we're rolling out, they're not residential per se, because quite often keeping somebody in their own home is the right thing to do, but providing some support for them, and it's providing that support albeit in their community. So that's why, as I say, the centres that we've rolled out are predicated on that in the large urban areas, with slightly different styles, if I can put it that way, in the areas that don't have the same critical mass of population.
But it isn't an issue of protecting budgets. You know, local authorities say protecting their budgets and saying, well, you know, we don't want to take this as costly. I'm glad that, you know, they're not being cooperative, let's put it like that, with the judiciary. There's no issue there at all.
Not that I'm aware of.
You're all shaking their heads saying no, so I take it. Ms Muffet, do you
I was just going to say that typically the decision to remand someone is made by a sentencer, so very often there's no conversation before that decision. And what the Cabinet Secretary is saying is that what we do know anecdotally is that for a lot of sentencers, they want to have confidence that there are robust alternatives to remand.
I understand that. My point was being made is that perhaps the robust alternatives are not on offer because we're protecting budgets. That's not an issue.
But part of what we're trying to do through the centres and through the Change Fund is to increase the availability and the consistency of that provision.
That's fine. No, you've settled my query about that. Sandra, John Finney, John Pentland and Roderick.
Thank you very much, Convener. Probably a follow-on to the questions that were asked there, and can I just say, I don't know if anyone else has said it yet, but I certainly do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement of the extra £3 million, which was announced today, to help women offenders in prison. And one of the issues I wanted to raise, and I don't know if you've actually answered it, I probably have, is about the Women's Justice Centres, which you mentioned in Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh and Aberdeen. And obviously it's part of the Angelini Commission. The convener was talking about remand prisoners, and we also mentioned about the justice system being involved in that also. They were talking about a one-shop model within the Glasgow area anyway, in Edinburgh and Dundee. Does this envisage what you were saying earlier, Ms Moffat, in regards to sheriffs, etc., knowing there's an alternative there? And what is envisaged by the one-stop shop, and what agencies will be working there? I think the Cabinet Secretary may have touched on the other 8 projects that were mentioned, talking about smaller projects, similar in Angus, etc. Could you maybe expand on them as well, what offers? And can I just say that I think Ms McConnell and the prison service are doing an excellent job, having visited Cottonvale and other prisons before and seen the changes in it. I think there's great dedication there to make things much better for women in the criminal justice system. I just wanted to put that on the record, but perhaps if it can expand on what I've asked. I'm very impressed by the work that's going on. I will admit that. Sorry.
I think you're obliged to send a Christmas card now, Ms McConnell. You do understand that. Give the address later.
Dame Eilish and our Commission gave us a very clear blueprint, I think, for how we should really optimise the configuration of services in the community, to put the women at the centre and for the agencies to come together and coalesce around the women and provide a holistic approach. So it's fair to say that we've got that work underway. The centres that the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen will all have a slightly different approach in the short term, but ultimately they're all aiming to get to the same place where we have all of the multidisciplinary partners that we need in order to get the best possible outcome for a woman. That will indeed include colleagues from the prison service as well at some point, because we see that in order to truly kind of crack the nut of through care, we need to make sure that everyone that's involved in all of the parts of the system all the way round, and indeed around again, because we know women and indeed others go round and round the system a number of times until they personally are ready to make the change, and sometimes very difficult change that's going to ultimately result in them reducing their reoffending and perhaps leading a life free of crime. So initially it will be the kind of traditional partners that you would envisage. So it will be criminal justice social work, it will be third sector partners who are working in the sector, it will be health workers, it will be addiction workers. But ultimately we aim to then involve procurator, fiscal, police colleagues, prison service colleagues, housing colleagues, anyone really who has an interest in making sure that we can help a woman turn her life around.
Right, that seems to be that one dealt with. John Finney, followed by Roderick, please.
Thank you, Convener. A question for Ms McConnell and a couple for the Cabinet Secretary. Mr McConnell, the issue of developing induction packages for your staff dealing, can you give us an update on that? I'm particularly interested, the phrase I have here, it's anticipated this training will also be extended to existing staff. So clearly, is there a shortfall in the training you feel that's been delivered, that existing staff have at the moment?
I think it's a recognition that our population is diverse. It's not a homogeneous grouping, and I think as we move forward, particularly as we learn more in terms of how to work individually with women who pass into care, and there's a similar project underway with the young men at Palmont. I think what we really are understanding is that our staff in future need to be trained and developed in a number of approaches and techniques aimed at particular groups and populations. So I think the approach in the future is perhaps as we'd get in other industries, is a general training which is then developed upon as our staff move around and working with different populations. So, as I say, that work is already underway. It's probably the leading edge of it is with the women at Contvale and all the thinking that's coming out of the Inverclyde and Edinburgh projects, as well as being informed, the sense coming up on the rails, is the great work that Education Scotland and the Prison Service are doing in terms of our future developments for a secure college at Parliament. So all of that will, as I say, inform a richness in future to the development and training of prison staff.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to ask you about and I welcome the report we have here and indeed the additional money, as my colleague Sandra White said. Examining the universal public service involvement in offender recognition, you state in the report you've started a ministerial group. Is that a time limited?
Yeah, I mean, this is about convening all my colleagues who share the issues under my auspices to drive it forward. We've been taking not just people who, not just the ministers who have portfolio responsibilities on housing, on work, on health, and local government, but bringing together other people. We've heard from those who are at the coalface, so to speak, in terms of being in prison. So we're cooperating with them. We have had our first meeting. The remaining meetings will be themed around matters that we think will provide, as I say, the necessary direction. So that's where we're at. Can't give you the precise date we're going to conclude at, but you know, it's meant to be short and look at it and address it.
And to what end, if that isn't a...
I think it's to make sure that to do at governmental level what we're seeking to do at coalface level, that those of us who have a ministerial responsibility have an obligation to ensure that when we want to make sure that health are speaking to local government, are speaking to prison service, are speaking to other agencies, that we do that ministerially so that things don't fall between two stools, so that local government and health are joined up with justice. And I think it's also about driving a message that the solution to the problems that we face with many of these individuals cannot be dealt with solely by law enforcement. There are some individuals who are career criminals or commit an offence. The only solution is it will be dealt with by police, prosecutors, courts and the prison service. There are others where the invariably default position, as you will know from your own work and lifetime experience, is the police or ultimately the prison service. The solution lies actually in education, in health, in housing, in all these matters. So it's to get that governmental joined up position so that we can make sure that we drill it down and pass it down and get it at this coalface.
Okay, thank you. In relation to your announcement and the welcome additional money, there's reference to the 4 city centres there and 7 other areas. And to be parochial for a minute, representing the Highlands and Islands, a very large geographic area, and I know you used the term critical mass earlier. Well, that's a large geographic critical mass, and sadly we do have women offenders there. You talked about the outreach services, for instance, Angus, I think you mentioned there. What assurance can you give that the additional benefits that are going to be accrued elsewhere in Scotland aren't going to be missed out in Highlands and Islands, and indeed other geographic parts that aren't covered?
We're currently working with colleagues in Highland. They weren't ready to submit their bid for the timetable that we had for this first tranche of money, but we are expecting a bid from them in December, and that will be to augment the services that they have for women in the Highland area.
Okay, thank you. That's very reassuring. Thank you.
Roderick, please.
Cabinet Secretary, I'd just like to ask you for a bit more information on what's intended for problem-solving courts and the pilots, which you propose to get underway in December, as to what kind of matters are actually going to come before these courts. How are they going to work in practice?
Well, we're trialling this approach in sheriff summary courts, which limits the sort of offences that might be dealt with, simply because we won't be dealing with those on solemn matters. We can't predict what sort of offences will be dealt with until the proposals are submitted. The CGAs have been invited to submit proposals based on an in-depth knowledge of local issues and indeed discussion with clearly with the local judiciary. We are simply setting some targets and criteria that it's at the right category of offender in areas where there are gaps in service provision and in courts which have the capacity and motivation to adopt a problem-solving approach. So although we're hoping to press on with this as soon as possible, we are, as I say, seeking to get partners round the table to make sure that when it goes with the right people dealing with it in terms of the judiciary that are presiding, that the appropriate matters are going before them, which requires police and prosecution to be tied in, and indeed once the sentencer is dealing with it, that we have the appropriate systems in court so things are dealt with quickly, that they go back in the main to the same sentencer, and indeed that same sentencer, as Ms Muffet and others have been commenting on, perhaps has access and knowledge of what is available to solve the problem.
How long are the pilot schemes going to run for before evaluation?
I would need to come back to you on that. It's ongoing evaluation, so we'll base it, suck it and see.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and I'm not looking at anybody because there are apparently that's the end of the questions. So can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and for the sessions today, and I'm now going to and other Ms McConnell, Ms Muffet, my apologies for not thanking you because I was thanking you as well. But I'm just moving on now to item 4 on the agenda. Let's everybody give you a moment to clear. Always looking at my timings. Sometimes I lose. I don't pay attention. I'm busy looking at the other stuff. So I'm trying to see there are no further questions and looking because somebody always puts their hand up. So now I'm doing this. I don't see any other questions. You need to get in there. Right. Item 4: Offensive Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communications Act 2012. This is consideration of emails that many emails, duplicates, but it is a petition which entitled to do. Can we turn to paper 3 that you have before you on our agenda? And just to remind you, we last considered this issue at our meeting on 18th June. We have since received, as I said, a number of identical emails regarding the operation of the Act. A copy of that email is with your papers. You'll see it calls for an early review of the Act. And now, as the legislation stands, and as this, I think it was this committee successfully did, the Scottish Government is required to review the operation of the offences in the Act for the period 1st of August 2012 to 1st August 2014 and lay a report of its review before the Parliament by 1st of August 2015. I think it was 2 football seasons that we're going to let it run. The paper sets out possible options. You're not tied to those. The Minister has indicated in correspondence made her views that the review period is currently set out in that should continue to apply. I'm looking at the date of all that correspondence. Mind you, it was May. I think all of it is Lord Advocate, Chief Constable, Minister are all May 2013. So we could ask, well, I'll ask you what you think first before we go any further. What's your position? What do you suggest? We could ask her to respond to these comments because it's 6 months old, and the Chief Constable and the Lord Advocate. We could ask her to bring forward an early review. We could wait or some other solution. Can I just have your views one at a time, please? John.
Convener, yes, there have been a lot of emails about this, and I think that indicates the strength of feeling there is around the issue. I was very supportive of the legislation. I think it was needed, and people can maybe comment on how effective it is from different perspectives. But what's very clear is that from one perspective, it seemed to had an undue bearing on a particular group of football supporters. As people know, it's not the team I support. I am very, and I say that because, well, I say that because it's not meant to be amusing. It is meant to indicate that there are a range of views on how this. But our job as a committee is to accept that there's a deep sense of feeling and a deep sense of concern about how this has been applied to one group. And for that reason, I am very supportive of an early review of the legislation. We do have the review, and I think it's Stirling University doing it. It's a 2-year academic review. But I have to say, if some young football supporter, to quote from one of the emails, is having a camera thrust in their face whilst at a football game, then they're not interested in the academic aspects of this. They're not interested in the legal aspects. They're interested in the practical aspects. Now, this seems to primarily relate to issues about what isn't acceptable or found to be offensive singing. And I have to say, one of the emails, and it's not the regular one, the one that caught my eye when I arrived in Edinburgh in the early hours of the morning this morning and read it, was the one that talked about terrorism and Nelson Mandela. I think other committee members got that. Now, certainly a view at one time that in Mrs Thatcher's day that Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist and someone singing songs about him would be vilified. People have different views on that. People have views on what's regarded as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland's national anthem. It's not a song that I warm to at all. So I think when we're down to a sizable group of people feeling that a piece of legislation disproportionately impacts on them, then I would like to have the subject of an early review. And I think that review is... I think there's a role for the police to explain if policing techniques are uniform across. Because I have to say, as someone who regularly attends football matches, my experience isn't altered in any way by this legislation. And that may in itself be significant, I don't know. So I favour an early review, and I think that we have to address the genuine concerns that are being put forward by it.
I've just asked the clerks if they had note of any of these, the particular allegations in these other emails you've mentioned, and they haven't. So I think it'd be useful if you've got them, apart from the one that was identical, if you've got separate ones that came in with specific instances, if you could let the clerks have them so the committee can see them.
If I may, I think it's right to give balance to the issue that we also discussed at length, which was the policing arrangements that related to the Gallagate. And I have to say I was disappointed, and I've told people in my response that I was disappointed that people didn't cooperate, because as we heard in the report, now that may have been overtaken by events, but if we have a review, it's important that the people calling for the review will cooperate with anyone charged with doing it.
But just specifically,
yes, no, I heard
these
you.
particular ones, if you'd forward them so other
yes,
members can see them. We're
yes,
talking,
okay.
Some of us are talking in ignorance of what others have received. That's just the first practical thing. Margaret, then Sandra, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Well, clearly there is a lot of concern about how this legislation is operating in practice and about the drafting of it initially, and it comes from widespread sources, including some of the judiciary. Sheriff Davidson saying it was horribly drafted. And it concerns me too, Convener, that the amount of resource that seems to be going on something that, according to the first set of annual statistics, with the conviction rates for the offences under the new Act, 68% compared to the 85% conviction rate for all crimes. There's a dedicated police unit to it. So I think there's sufficient there early enough in this process for us to merit suggesting a review. And I take fully on board the kind of problems of that. You know, for our committee, we're up to our eyes in it. I don't think it would be feasible for us to look at it, or even for a subcommittee of this committee to look at it. I do think it would be feasible for an ad hoc committee in the Parliament to be set up specifically to look at this, to take evidence and to come and report back quite quickly. And that would be my suggestion.
Sandra.
Thank you very much, Chair. Going back to John's point, when it first came to the committee, it was to do with the kettling, as they called it, in the Gallagate, and that was sub judice, and it was to do with policing. It had nothing at all to do with the Act, and that was pointed out. Then from there we got further representation of round-robin emails, and then maybe 4 or 5 individual emails that I've had in the past day or so, which I found the content of them equally quite horrible in some of the content that's in it. But going back to John's point, you mentioned the fact that we have had people, you know, complaining, and if there's a section of the community as a Justice Committee. But I see it as a Justice Committee, we have legislation. We did, as a Justice Committee, put forward an amendment which was accepted And I think we're duty bound to follow that legislation. Now, it came into force in January 12, was it? It's not even a year old. We have had the legislation that says we look at 2 full football seasons, and we will have the reports in August 2015. This work has been ongoing. Figures have been collated. I don't think it would serve any purpose whatsoever for us to look at a separate investigation or an ad hoc committee while the legislation is there and it's ongoing. And bearing in mind, this committee has already asked for the amendment. It's been received. So if you're saying, right, OK, accepted our amendment, now we're going to go back on it and look at something else, I certainly don't look forward.
I'll let you back in. I'll let everybody have their say first, because I've got Elaine, then Elaine, then Alison. Sorry. Yes, and then I'll let you back in.
Thanks. I'm very sympathetic to what both John and Margaret have said, actually, because I hadn't had many emails before. If I started to have a small number, I probably wouldn't get as many coming from the Fraser as maybe some other colleagues have had. But I think there are issues about the operation of the Act. I know the police horses came down to protect the Queen of the South match. I think it's probably quite appreciated by the fans, but normally we wouldn't be having that sort of resource being put into policing a match. I think there is clearly an issue. We wouldn't be getting all these emails if there wasn't an issue and it wasn't a matter of concern. And I think maybe Margaret's suggestion of an ad hoc committee rather than... We obviously don't have much time in our timetable with the legislation we're looking at, but an ad hoc committee might be the way forward. And I'm sure, actually, from what I've heard other MSPs saying, there are a number of people who probably would be quite keen to serve on that ad hoc committee. I'm just not quite sure of the process of doing that, whether that has to go through the business managers or whoever at the Bureau.
Alison, then Margaret, then John Pentland, then Roderick Campbell.
I agree with John and Margaret. I mean, there is deep disquiet about the application of this Act, and I think there's a concern that there is a disproportionate impact on one particular group of people, and I think the onus is on the Parliament to revisit this. I mean, members will know that I did not support this legislation. I thought it was heavy-handed and dangerous, but it gives me no, satisfaction to say, well, some of the concerns that I raised are coming to fruition. We need to look at it again, and if the government is not prepared to do that in the short term, then I think it's appropriate that the Parliament as a whole and as a cross-party group of people have a look at that, and I'm happy to support Margaret's idea of an ad hoc committee.
Sorry, Margaret, then John Pentland, then Roderick.
Just a point of clarification on Sandra's point, about the amendment. My understanding that was a maximum period of time by which the review should be carried out, but it didn't preclude us taking the kind of action we're considering today and bringing forward the review. Is that the case?
I think, well, that's another thing to clarify, yes. John and then Roderick, please. John.
Very quickly, convener. I mean, I was not a member of the Justice Committee previously, but I did receive, a grand total of a lot of emails, and subsequent to being on the committee, I've probably received much more, and I would tend to agree that I think there's so much ambiguity out in the public domain just now, and and I take on board what John's saying. It would only be pertain to one football club, but that in itself is no truly accurate. It certainly doesn't reflect what's happening in my constituency. It's just people going to the general local game where there is this real concern that they don't know whether they're doing something right or doing something wrong. And I would probably agree totally that perhaps the quicker we can bring it back to an early review, and I would kind of support Margaret that perhaps an ad hoc committee could indeed be set up.
Just checking the legislation. The review period is a period of 2 years. Yes. So there is a time. It isn't flexible in that you've got to let 2 seasons run, and that would end in August 2014. So that's just a point of clarification.
Was to allow for sufficient time for the impact of the Act to be judged, and that was part
but
of
it was just to clarify what the Act says, because I'd forgotten. I'm going to come... John, sorry, have you finished?
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Roderick, followed by John Finney, back in again. Roderick,
I think we're in danger of rushing this today. These emails are comparatively recent. There has been no comment from any member of the Scottish Government on that. We haven't referred it to them. And I think at the very least, as a first step, before we took any view as a committee, we ought to invite some further comment from the Government. And also, we do need to bear in mind that we've only had 1 year's annual statistics. I don't know whether the 1.8 million here needs further explanation. I'm looking at the minute of the meeting on the 18th of June. We did, in effect, invite people to comment on the legislation. And once they commented, we said that we would indeed find out whether it indeed was the case. The final words of the convener on that report said all these things can be passed to the police for comment in the first place. Not quite sure with hindsight what was meant by that, but it does seem to me possibly that there is some scope for inviting some further comment from the police on the operation of the Act too, and that we ought to have both these things to hand before we take any decision on any ad hoc committee or otherwise, which I would certainly oppose today.
Then I've got John Finney and then Colin.
Thank you, Convener. For the avoidance of doubt, I'm not suggesting we abort the ongoing academic study. Quite the reverse. I think that will inform. But what we can't do is just, if you like, hide behind that and say, well, you know, we'll just need to wait the outcome. This is day to day. It may only be a year, but that's 40 games. That's 40 experiences for a fan who feels. And as I stress, I don't feel in any way put down by this legislation, in my experience, both at various locations throughout Scotland. Of course, Roderick's absolutely right. I think we should ask the government, and Roderick's absolutely right. We should ask the police, and that's part of the review I'm talking about. These would be instrumental to it, to a review. But what I don't think we can do is ignore it. I think we must act.
No, and Colin.
Well, I'm finding myself. I think we are in a danger here of actually splitting, obviously, because I think we didn't come to the 2-year decision lightly. It was, we knew what the problems were, we knew exactly what the bill was trying to do, and I think 2 years was seen as a useful period of time to actually attempt to deal with what is an extremely long-standing problem in certain areas. As for the bill was never designed to hit one set of people or other. It's offensive behaviour at football. I'm quite prepared to take the same line as both Sandra and Rod. I think it's too soon anyway, and I'd give it the extra time that's required.
Well, I think, would it not be appropriate in the first instance? First of all, we need to see these other emails that you received with specific allegations that were made about the camera and the face, that kind of thing.
I'm trying to recount. I mean, if that's not what it says for Matam, I don't know. But it was the perception of intimidation.
Yes, but we don't have. We've only got the round robin one. So if you could send the other ones to the clerks, and my first suggestion would be that all of this material is put to the Minister, the Police, and the Lord Advocate in the first instance to ask them to respond to it. That doesn't close down anything else, but it would be appropriate, first of all, to say, OK, this is what we are being told. Let's hear from you about it. And then when we've got the replies, we then move on to whether we go for an ad hoc committee or we ask for an earlier review or whatever. But the first instance, we find out. Respond to this, please. Sorry, yeah.
I mean, it sounds to me as though we're halfway to doing review if we do that. We know the facts just now. We know the problems. We know the
we don't. That's the problem.
We know
Margaret.
the facts in terms of that there is a perceived problem with the drafting and the operation of the legislation. Now, with respect, I don't think what you're suggesting would move us forward. I think perhaps the review committee taking that kind of evidence, looking at it more fully, would move it forward. And I think, you know, we're looking at a committee that's already well stretched. I don't really see that would actually get us any further forward. Just now, I agree with John Finney, we know something needs to be done, and regardless of what will come back from the Cabinet Secretary and the...
Well, I think in fairness, whenever anything is put by anybody, I like to get a response back, and then you can say, well, we're not happy with this response.
But we've got a written response, Convener.
That's May. This is May. This is why I'm saying these are fresh fresh comments, and there seems to be things happening out there which you've referred to, and I'm not holding the direct quote, that throw real dubiety and perhaps policing aspects. Now, I would like a reply from the Chief Constable and from the Cabinet Secretary, the Minister, and from the Lord Advocate. And it doesn't need to be a long time away. We could get a time scale in a couple of weeks to get a reply. So it's not really kicking any long grass. It's just, let's hear what you've got to say about this first, and then move on to the other matters. John, I thought that's what you wanted.
That is what I want. I think that will inform a decision, and I'm very pleased that you said the time frame, because I think a quick turnaround is important.
It's not a problem.
Can I also ask that we perhaps the clerks get in touch with the collective fan associations of, because we are talking about the representations I've had have exclusively come from Glasgow Celtic supporters. So if the fan association, the collective supporters, whatever the grouping's called.
Well, it's on the record now, and I suppose I don't know how we would keep that within the time frame if we did it, because I was hoping that we could get something drafted today or tomorrow and let you all see it, by email, if you're content with the terms, to all these parties before we get it out, so we're not wasting time. Yes.
Chair, on board what John is saying, and the timescale, if you're going to go down that road, it's important. If we're going to ask any questions, and obviously I've had a couple of emails as well, I would like questions asked of the numbers that they're saying that through FOIs, they're completely against the numbers that the government's put forward. We need to get that information.
Well, no, I'm not. My position was simply, these are statements being brought to the committee that we want officers and the Lord Advocate and the Minister and the police to respond to in the first instance. If you want to go down the other stuff, then you're going into a full inquiry. But first of all, you say, here's what's come to us. Let's have your response. A couple of weeks' time, we can sit down and review the position and say, well, we've got these replies. Are we happy or are we not happy with this? And then take the next stage. But that would seem to be a balanced approach to the matter. Alison.
I'm a little uncomfortable with that, because I think what we have here are a few people who've been willing to put their heads above the parapet. We don't quite know the scale of the problem, and I would prefer a proper review that let us sort of draw evidence on that, rather than taking one or two of these things and saying to them, well, respond to that, please, Minister, and they might
not closing down review. It's 2 weeks to get, in fairness to anyone, to let them respond to this. We have not said anything, and in 2 weeks' time you're back with there will be no hiding place for ministers or police or anybody if they need a hiding place, because we'll have had a response. And if you're not happy with the response, you can do it again. But I think when people are being told things that
I can understand, convener, that
you don't
perhaps
give them
you're
a
trying
chance
to find a way forward which is consensual. I don't think we're going to be consensual here. I think probably what we've got here is a recommendation that perhaps we should go for an ad hoc because of all the circumstances surrounding this whole.
Right. Can I just take one at a time?
Surrounding this issue, right? And I certainly won't be supporting any further delay in what we've already asked here. Now, if it comes to a vote, then I think we should move it to a vote and then move on from there. John Finney has rightly said that the priests and the cabinet secretary should be part of that review that we're asking for, and I don't think there's any need for any further delay in going forward with.
This is the first time it's come up, John. I don't really think it's fair to call it a delay. It's the first time it's come up, and I'm saying in 2 weeks. I thought 2 weeks is about as short as I could make it. If I make it a week, I think that's a bit too short to get responses from Lord Advocate and Chief Constable, who may have to investigate, have a look and see what he feels about it. So I think, in fairness, I don't think 2 weeks is a long time. I'm taking John first and then Roderick.
I'm with you, and to reassure John, I'm not wanting anything delayed unduly, but I mean, if we are looking, and I don't know the practicalities of an ad hoc committee, whether that would be robust enough. Certainly, we have a very challenging workload, and much as it would maybe seem more appropriate this committee or the police committee look at it, that given the legislation that's coming our way, that might be very difficult.
But just as the police committee couldn't do, it's not part of our remit.
Right, okay,
so
I beg your pardon.
That's not
the other thing is that, of course, if we are going to have some form of inquiry, we would need the terms of reference and to be very clear. So unless we sit here for the next couple of hours trying to thrash that out, and I suggest we don't, since we've all got other commitments, then having that information from these sources, I think, will inform where we go forward. And I'm pretty sure that the people I've corresponded with will want action, and if that action requires a 2-week delay for it to be informed action, they'll be content with that.
In fact, I think they might be quite interested to see what replies we get back from the Lord Advocates. It then gives the opportunity for, because they would be in the public domain as well, and then the parties complaining about the legislation would have the opportunity to see what has been said and to take that on and come back. I just feel it's a balance that we ought to be.
On the 18th of June that we said when we got kind of comments in, we would pass them to police for comment in the first place. So to rush ahead and then take a decision to set up some kind of review without even asking the police just contradicts what we did in June.
I hope we can come to... I didn't want you to split over this because it's a serious matter if legislation is wrongfully being applied, whatever the legislation is. But I would have thought, whatever we came to this committee, if there's an issue raised, that it's appropriate to get an opportunity for a right to reply, if we like to call it that, before we do anything further. It doesn't close it down by any means. And I would hope that you would perhaps agree, and you can see the terms of the letters, that would go out. We put them round the committee so that you can see it, just and with access to some of the other correspondence that come in that I may not have seen, the allegations and so on. Put it to them, and then say we require a response by whatever a fortnight from today is, in order that the committee can review and consider, and let them know. Let them know we are considering certain options. Well, it's on the record anyway. We are considering certain options, and we require this to inform where the committee takes it next. That puts everybody in notice. John.
Well, considering that the mover, who suggested that an early review is possible, he's quite happy to wait for me. I think probably
that would be. I'm very grateful if you could do that, because I wouldn't want them. I wouldn't want us scrapping over this. I want us to do justice to it. Yes.
I think as long as we do make a commitment that we take a decision in 2 weeks' time, we don't.
Oh yes.
If somebody hasn't got back just now.
I've known usually, Elaine. Usually letters just get out because they're run-of-the-mill kinds of things. But I think because you've all been gracious enough to come to a view on this, is that we will put a letter round, and can we have it done by the end of today? Before the close of business today, right? And see that you're satisfied with the letters. And I think it can probably be in the same terms to all three, probably just the same terms. So it'll be the Minister, Chief Constable and Lord Advocate. Thank you very much. Now, you can't just go. We've got the next meeting is, I'm afraid it's another 9:30 on Tuesday, 12th of November, when we'll consider and agree our budget report and take Stage 2 amendments on the Victims and Witnesses Bill. And can I remind you that the deadline for Stage 2 amendments for our section of that bill is 12 noon this Thursday. Right? And that concludes the meeting.